Picture this. You're standing in a vast, empty void where fire and ice collide in violent eruption. From this cosmic chaos, giants emerge from melting frost, while venomous serpents gnaw at the roots of reality itself. Above you, one-eyed gods sacrifice their own flesh for forbidden knowledge, while below, the dead march in endless armies toward a final battle that will consume everything. This isn't science fiction. This isn't fantasy. This is the terrifying, beautiful, and utterly captivating world that shaped an entire civilization's understanding of existence itself. Welcome to the complete chronological journey through Nordic mythology, where gods die, heroes fall, and the universe itself has an expiration date written in blood and fire. I'm about to take you through every single moment of this incredible mythological timeline, from the very first spark of creation to the apocalyptic flames that will one day devour it all. Now, you might think you know Norse mythology. Maybe you've seen Thor in the movies or heard about Odin and his ravens. But I guarantee you've never experienced the full, unfiltered story told exactly as it was meant to be told, in chronological order, with all the shocking details that Hollywood tends to leave out. Because the real Norse myths aren't just adventure stories. They're a complete worldview, a philosophical framework, and honestly, some of the most metal narratives ever conceived by human imagination. What we're about to explore comes from ancient texts that survived against impossible odds. Manuscripts written on animal skin, preserved in Icelandic libraries containing the collective spiritual DNA of an entire people. These aren't just stories. They're the foundation myths that explained everything from why thunder exists to why good people sometimes suffer, from how the world began to exactly how it will end. And here's what makes this journey particularly fascinating. Unlike most mythologies that focus on eternal, unchanging gods, Norse mythology is obsessed with endings. Every god knows their fate. Every hero understands their doom. Every story builds toward Ragnarok, the twilight of the gods, where even the mightiest deities will fall. It's mythology with a countdown timer, and that changes everything about how these stories work. So settle in, because we're about to embark on the most comprehensive telling of Nordic mythology you've ever encountered. We'll start at the literal beginning of existence and follow every major event, every crucial character, every earth-shaking battle, all the way to the bitter end and beyond. This is the story of how an entire cosmos lived, loved, fought, and died. Let's begin at the very beginning, in a place called Ginnungagap. Chapter 1. The Void and the First Spark. Long before there were gods, giants, or even the concept of existence as we understand it, there was nothing but a cosmic gap called Ginnungagap. Imagine the most complete emptiness you can fathom, then multiply that by infinity. No light, no sound, no substance, just pure, waiting void. But this wasn't the peaceful emptiness of sleep. This was a hungry void, pregnant with potential, stretched between two extreme realms that would define everything to come. To the north lay Niflheim, a realm of primordial ice, mist, and bone-chilling cold. To the south burned Muspelheim, a world of pure fire, lava, and scorching heat. These weren't just locations. They were fundamental forces, the yin and yang of Norse creation, locked in eternal opposition. From Niflheim flowed 11 rivers called the Vagar, streams of poison and ice that slowly crept toward the void's center. As these toxic waters moved away from their frozen source, they began to harden into massive glacial formations, layer upon layer of primordial ice. Meanwhile, from Muspelheim came waves of heat and sparks, carried on winds of flame and ash. Where these opposing forces met in Ginnungagap's heart, something extraordinary happened. The ice began to melt, and from those first drops of cosmic Thor emerged life itself. Not gentle, pastoral life, but violent, primordial existence in its rawest form. The first being to emerge was Ymir. But calling him a giant doesn't capture the sheer impossibility of his scale. Ymir was a force of nature given form, a living mountain of flesh and hunger. He wasn't benevolent or evil in any way we'd understand. He simply was, a fact of existence as fundamental as gravity or time. But Ymir wasn't alone in this newborn cosmos. From the same melting ice came Odumla, a primordial cow whose very existence made all subsequent life possible. While Ymir fed on Odumla's milk, growing larger and more powerful with each passing moment, the cosmic cow sustained herself by licking the salty ice formations around her. This detail might seem strange, but it's crucial to understanding how Norse mythology works. These aren't sanitized fairy tales. They're raw, biological stories about survival, hunger, and the fundamental drives that shape existence. Mere drinking milk from a cosmic cow while she licks ice for sustenance? That's the Norse way of saying that even the most basic existence requires consumption, transformation, and interdependence. As Audumla continued her patient licking of the ice, something remarkable began to emerge. Day by day, her warm tongue revealed hair, then features, then finally, an entire figure trapped within the frozen walls of creation. This was Buri, the first of the gods, born not through any divine proclamation, but through the simple, persistent work of a cosmic cow licking ice. Buri represented something entirely different from Ymir. Where the giant embodied raw, chaotic existence, Buri brought the possibility of order, intelligence, and purpose. He was beautiful where Ymir was terrible, conscious where Ymir was instinctual, divine where Ymir was primordial. Buri had a son named Bor, who would prove crucial to the next phase of creation. Bor, displaying the complex relationships that would define Norse mythology forever, married Bestla, a giantess descended from Ymir's bloodline. This wasn't an accident or a mistake. It was the first example of a pattern that would repeat throughout Norse myth. Gods and giants weren't separate species, but different expressions of the same cosmic forces, capable of intermarriage, alliance, and conflict. From this union of divine and giant blood came three brothers who would reshape existence itself: Odin, Vili, and Ve. These weren't the polished marble statue gods of other mythologies. They were rough, practical beings who looked at the chaotic cosmos around them and decided it needed serious renovation. The brothers faced a fundamental problem. The universe was dominated by Ymir and his ever-growing progeny of giants. These beings weren't evil, but they were chaotic, unpredictable, and fundamentally opposed to any kind of ordered existence. For the cosmos to develop beyond its current state of primordial chaos, something had to change. So Odin, Vili, and Ve made a decision that would echo through every subsequent myth. They killed Ymir. This wasn't a clean, heroic battle. It was cosmic butchery, the deliberate destruction of the primordial force that had given birth to their own existence. When Ymir fell, his blood flowed so abundantly that it created a flood that drowned almost all of his giant offspring, leaving only a few survivors to carry on their lineage. But the brothers weren't interested in mere destruction. They were architects of a new kind of existence, and Ymir's massive corpse became their raw material. From his flesh, they shaped the earth itself, creating the realm that would become known as Midgard. His blood became the oceans, lakes, and rivers. His bones were transformed into mountains and cliffs, while his teeth and broken bone fragments became stones and boulders scattered across the landscape. The giant's skull became the dome of the sky itself, held up by four dwarfs, whose names became the cardinal directions: Nordri, north; Sudri, south; Ostri, east; and Vestri, west. His brains were scattered to become clouds, while his eyebrows formed a protective barrier around Midgard, keeping the ordered world safe from the chaos that still existed beyond its borders. To bring light to their creation, the brothers captured sparks and embers from Muspelheim setting them in the sky to become stars, sun, and moon. They established the cycles of day and night, the turning of seasons, and the basic rhythms that would govern all life to come. But a world, no matter how carefully crafted, is meaningless without consciousness to experience it. The brothers found 2 pieces of driftwood washed up on Midgard's shores, 1 ash and 1 elm. Into these simple pieces of wood, they breathed the essence of humanity itself. Odin gave them breath and life. Vili provided consciousness and emotion, while Ve granted them senses, speech, and the ability to perceive their world. These became Ask and Embla, the first humans, ancestors of all mortal life that would populate Midgard. They weren't created as servants or playthings of the gods, but as independent beings capable of their own thoughts, choices, and destinies. To bind their new creation together, the brothers established Yggdrasil, the world tree. This wasn't just a very large tree. It was the cosmic axis, the central pillar that connected all of existence. Its branches reached into every realm, its roots extended into the deepest mysteries of creation, and its trunk served as the highway between different levels of reality. Yggdrasil was alive in every sense, home to creatures both wise and dangerous. At its crown perched an eagle, observing all of existence with ancient eyes. Running up and down its trunk was Ratatoska, a squirrel whose job was to carry messages and gossip between the eagle above and the dragon below. And at the roots gnawed Nidhogger, a serpent whose constant chewing at the tree's foundation represented the ever-present threat of dissolution and chaos. This cosmic tree held together 9 distinct worlds, each with its own character, inhabitants, and role in the greater cosmic order. These weren't just different countries or planets, but entirely different modes of existence, different ways that consciousness and matter could organize themselves. At the top was Asgard, the shining realm of the Aesir gods, connected to Midgard by Bifrost, the Rainbow Bridge. Below Midgard lay the realm of the dead, while around it stretched the lands of giants, elves, and dwarfs. Each world had its own laws, its own dangers, and its own contribution to the cosmic whole. With the basic structure of existence in place, the stage was set for the complex interactions, alliances, betrayals, and conflicts that would define Norse mythology for eons to come. The gods had created order from chaos, but they had also inherited chaos's eternal opposition to that order. The giants who survived Ymir's death would never forget or forgive that cosmic murder, setting up the fundamental tension that would eventually lead to Ragnarok. This is how Norse mythology understands creation, not as a peaceful, benevolent process, but as a violent struggle between opposing forces that creates something beautiful and terrible and doomed all at once. The universe was born from murder and built from a corpse, sustained by constant struggle and destined to end in mutual destruction. And yet, within this dark framework, there was room for love, heroism, wisdom, and hope. The gods had their realms, humans had their world, and all the various powers of existence had their roles to play. But the fundamental questions remained. How long could this order last? What would it cost to maintain? And what would rise from its ashes when it inevitably fell? These questions would drive every story to come, as gods and mortals alike struggled to find meaning, purpose, and joy within a cosmos that had written its own ending before the first chapter was complete. Chapter 2: The War That Shaped Eternity. Picture this. 2 armies of gods, each wielding powers that could reshape reality itself, locked in the first divine civil war in cosmic history. Spells that could twist fate itself clash against weapons forged from starlight and divine fury. This wasn't just a battle for territory or resources. This was a war over the very nature of existence, and its outcome would determine whether the universe would be ruled by warriors or magicians, by strength or by wisdom. This is the story of the Aesir-Vanir War, the conflict that nobody talks about, but that changed everything about how the Norse cosmos would function forever. Most people jump straight to Thor and his hammer, or Odin hanging from the world tree. But before any of those famous stories could happen, before the gods could unite against the giants, before Ragnarok could even be prophesied, there had to be this war, and trust me, understanding this conflict is the key to understanding why Norse mythology works the way it does. See, when most mythologies describe their pantheons, they present them as unified families or councils. The Greeks had their Olympians, all basically getting along under Zeus's rule. But the Norse gods we know and love, are actually the result of a cosmic merger, a divine corporate acquisition sealed in blood and magic after the most devastating supernatural war ever fought. In the gleaming halls of Asgard, the Aesir had established themselves as the warrior gods, the divine embodiment of strength, courage, and martial prowess. Led by Odin, who was already developing his obsession with wisdom and war, they valued honor gained through battle, glory earned through conquest, and strength demonstrated through conflict. Their halls echoed with the clash of weapons, the roar of victory songs, and the endless preparation for the battles to come. These weren't gentle pastoral deities. Thor was already swinging his hammer at anything that looked threatening. Tyr was establishing himself as the god of just warfare, the divine principle that some conflicts are not only necessary, but righteous. Frigg was weaving the fates of heroes and kings, ensuring that bravery would be rewarded and cowardice punished. The Aesir represented order imposed through strength, civilization built on the foundation of superior force. But beyond Asgard's golden walls lay another divine realm entirely, one that operated on completely different principles. Vanaheim was the home of the Vanir, gods who represented fertility, prosperity, wisdom, and the kind of magic that worked through understanding rather than domination. Where the Aesir conquered, the Vanir cultivated. Where the Aesir imposed order through strength, the Vanir created harmony through insight. The Vanir were led by Njörður, master of wind and wave, whose power over the seas made him essential to any coastal civilization. His children, Freyr and Freya, embodied the forces of fertility and prosperity that made civilization possible in the first place. But more than that, the Vanir possessed Seidur, a form of magic that the Aesir found both fascinating and deeply unsettling. Seidur wasn't the kind of magic that shot lightning bolts or summoned warriors. It was subtle, transformative magic that could alter fate itself, change the fundamental nature of reality, and see into the deepest truths of existence. It was magic that required understanding rather than force, patience rather than aggression, and wisdom rather than courage. To the warrior-minded Aesir, this kind of power was simultaneously attractive and threatening. They could see its usefulness, but they couldn't understand its principles. And in Norse culture, anything you can't understand through direct confrontation is inherently suspicious. The tension between these two divine philosophies might have remained just that, a philosophical difference between cosmic neighbors, if not for a single, catastrophic event that forced the issue into open warfare. A Vanir goddess named Gullveig arrived in Asgard as what appeared to be a diplomatic visitor. She was beautiful, mysterious, and possessed of powerful Seidur magic that immediately captivated the Aesir. But Gullveig wasn't content to simply visit. She began demonstrating her powers, showing the Aesir gods feats of magic they had never imagined possible. She could see the future with perfect clarity. She could alter the threads of fate that governed all existence. She could transform one substance into another, heal injuries that should have been fatal, and speak with the dead as easily as conversing with the living. The Aesir were simultaneously amazed and terrified. But here's where the story gets complicated, because Gullveig didn't just demonstrate her powers. She began to influence events in Asgard, subtly altering outcomes, shifting probabilities, and generally making the Aesir feel like they were no longer in control of their own realm. To gods accustomed to ruling through strength and direct action, this felt like the worst kind of violation. The Aesir's response was typically direct and completely disastrous. They seized Gullveig and attempted to destroy her by casting her into a fire, but saga magic doesn't work according to the normal rules of cause and effect. Instead of dying, Gullveig emerged from the flames reborn, more powerful than before and very much alive. Frustrated and increasingly frightened, the Aesir tried again. They built a larger fire, gathered more power, and cast her into the flames with greater force. Again, she emerged unharmed, her magic stronger for having passed through the ordeal. A third time they tried to destroy her, and a third time she returned, laughing at their futile attempts. Finally, they gave up on killing her, and instead drove her from Asgard, naming her Haida, the Bright One, and declaring her magic too dangerous to be tolerated in their realm. They had failed to destroy her, failed to control her, and failed to understand her. By any measure, Gullveig had defeated them completely. When word of this treatment reached Vanaheim, the Vanir were outraged beyond measure. To them, the attempted murder of their emissary wasn't just an act of war. It was a fundamental violation of cosmic order. Gullveig had come in peace, offered her knowledge freely, and been rewarded with betrayal and violence. This was exactly the kind of brutish behavior they expected from the warrior gods, and it proved that the Aesir were unfit to rule the cosmos alone. The Vanir demanded reparations, apologies, and guarantees that such treatment would never happen again. The proud Aesir, already embarrassed by their failure to deal with Gullveig effectively, refused all demands. They had acted according to their principles, protecting their realm from what they saw as a dangerous foreign influence, and they would not apologize for doing what they believed was right. And so the war began. What followed was unlike any conflict the cosmos had ever seen. This wasn't a simple matter of armies clashing on battlefields. This was a war between two completely different approaches to divine power, and both sides brought their fundamental nature to bear on the conflict. The Aesir fought as they always fought, with overwhelming force, superior tactics, and the kind of martial prowess that had made them masters of Asgard. Odin led charges that shook the foundations of reality itself, his spear, Gungnir, striking down enemies with perfect accuracy. Thor's hammer Mjolnir sent thunder rolling across the cosmic battlefields, while lesser Aesir gods demonstrated why strength and courage had made them the dominant divine power in their part of the cosmos. But the Vanir fought with saga magic, and that changed everything about how warfare could work. They wove spells that turned the Aesir's own strengths against them, created illusions that made armies attack their own allies, and used their knowledge of fate to always be exactly where their enemies didn't expect them to be. Worse, from the Aesir perspective, the Vanir could alter the fundamental conditions of battle itself. They could make weapons refuse to strike, armor turn to paper, and courage transform into paralyzing fear. They fought not by overpowering their enemies, but by changing the rules of engagement entirely. The war raged across multiple realms, with neither side able to gain a decisive advantage. The Aesir's superior military might was consistently neutralized by the Vanir's reality-altering magic, while the Vanir's subtle powers proved insufficient to deliver a knockout blow against enemies who simply refused to stay defeated. Years passed. Then decades. The cosmic infrastructure that both sides had worked to create began to suffer under the strain of constant warfare. Trade routes between realms were disrupted. The careful balance of forces that maintained cosmic stability was thrown into chaos, and both divine factions found themselves weakened by their inability to resolve their conflict. Finally, exhausted by years of inconclusive warfare, Both sides agreed to negotiate. The war had proven that neither divine philosophy was sufficient on its own. The Aesir's strength without wisdom was brutal, but ultimately limited, while the Vanir's wisdom without strength was profound, but sometimes ineffective. A synthesis was necessary. The peace treaty they negotiated was unlike anything seen before or since in mythological history. Rather than one side surrendering to the other, they agreed to a complete merger of their divine families. The most important Vanir gods would come to live in Asgard permanently, while selected Aesir would take up residence in Vanaheim. Njörður came to Asgard and was welcomed as a full member of the Divine Council, his mastery of wind and wave making him invaluable to the Aesir's cosmic responsibilities. His son Freyr brought his power over fertility and prosperity, ensuring that the realms would remain abundant and thriving. But it was Freyr who truly transformed Asgard. Freyr didn't just bring her beauty and her power over love and fertility. She brought Sader magic itself to the Aesir, teaching even Odin the subtle arts that the Vanir had mastered. This wasn't just a cultural exchange. It was a fundamental transformation of what divine power could be and how it could be used. Under Freyr's tutelage, Odin learned to see the future, to alter fate, and to work magic that operated through understanding rather than force. This knowledge would prove crucial to his later adventures, from his sacrifice on Yggdrasil to his endless quest for wisdom. The All-Father's legendary cunning and magical power were direct results of what he learned from the Vanir goddess. The merger wasn't without its complications. The Aesir had to learn to work with powers they didn't fully understand, while the Vanir had to adapt to a more aggressive, direct approach to cosmic governance. There were personality conflicts, cultural misunderstandings, and the occasional divine argument that shook the foundations of reality. But ultimately, the merger created something stronger than either divine family had been alone. The combined Aesir-Vanir pantheon possessed both the martial strength necessary to maintain cosmic order and the wisdom necessary to do so justly. They could fight when fighting was needed, and negotiate when negotiation was possible. They could impose their will through force, but also win hearts through understanding. This divine synthesis established the cosmic order that would define Norse mythology for the rest of its existence. Every subsequent story, from Odin's quest for wisdom to Thor's battles with giants, from Baldur's death to the final conflict of Ragnarok, takes place within the framework established by this ancient war and its revolutionary resolution. The Aesir-Vanir War taught the gods that strength without wisdom is brutality, while wisdom without strength is impotence. True divine power required both, and the cosmos was better served by gods who could adapt their approach to the needs of each situation. But the war also established a troubling precedent. Even the gods themselves were not immune to conflict, betrayal, and the kind of catastrophic misunderstandings that could tear apart the foundations of existence itself. If the divine powers could war against each other so devastatingly, what did that say about the ultimate stability of the cosmic order they maintained? These questions would echo through every subsequent myth, a constant reminder that even divine power was finite, even cosmic order was fragile, and even the gods themselves were subject to the same forces of conflict and change that governed all existence. The war was over, but its lessons would shape everything to come. Chapter 3. The All-Father's Terrible Price. Imagine willingly stabbing yourself with a spear, hanging from a tree for 9 days without food or water, and staring into an endless void until your sanity nearly breaks, all for the chance to learn something that might help you delay the end of the world. Most people would call that insanity. Odin called it Tuesday. This is the story of how the king of the gods became the most terrifying scholar in cosmic history, and why his relentless pursuit of knowledge would ultimately damn everything he was trying to save. You see, Odin wasn't content to be just another powerful god sitting on a throne, making pronouncements and expecting worship. From the moment he helped create the cosmos by butchering Ymir, Odin was haunted by a simple, devastating realization. He had glimpsed the future, and it was absolute horror. He had seen Ragnarok, the twilight of the gods, the day when everything he had built would burn to ash and bone. Most beings, divine or otherwise, would have responded to this knowledge with despair, denial, or desperate attempts to change their fate through conventional means. But Odin was different. Odin decided that if knowledge was power, then he would acquire knowledge at any cost, no matter how terrible that cost might be. He would become the most informed being in existence, and maybe, just maybe, information would be the weapon that could wound destiny itself. His first target was Mimir's well, a source of wisdom so profound that even the gods spoke of it in whispers. The well sat at the roots of Yggdrasil, guarded by Mimir, a being whose knowledge stretched back to the very foundations of existence. Mimir wasn't cruel, but he was absolutely uncompromising. Wisdom had a price, and that price was always exactly equal to the value of what you sought to learn. When Odin arrived at the well and requested a drink from its wisdom-granting waters, Mimir looked at him with eyes that had seen the birth and death of countless worlds. The price, Mimir announced, would be one of Odin's eyes. Not metaphorically, not symbolically. Literally, one eyeball. Removed from his skull and dropped into the well's dark waters as payment. Any reasonable god would have negotiated, sought alternatives, or at least asked for time to consider such a drastic demand. Odin immediately carved out his own eye and let it sink into the well's depths. The agony was indescribable, but the knowledge that flooded his mind as he drank from those sacred waters was worth every moment of pain. From that day forward, Odin walked through the cosmos with one eye missing, a constant reminder of the price he was willing to pay for understanding. But more than that, his sacrifice had fundamentally altered his perception of reality. Where others saw only the present moment, Odin could glimpse the vast web of cause and effect that connected all events across time and space. But even this cosmic perspective wasn't enough. Odin had tasted true wisdom, and like any addict, he needed more. His next target was the runes, mystical symbols that represented the fundamental forces underlying all existence. These weren't just letters or magical tools, they were the source code of reality itself. The divine programming language that determined how matter, energy, consciousness, and fate would interact throughout the cosmos. The problem was that no one, not even the wisest gods, truly understood how the runes worked. They existed, they had power, but their secrets remained locked away from anyone who might seek to master them. Odin realized that conventional study would never be sufficient. The runes would only reveal themselves to someone who had experienced the ultimate sacrifice, someone who had literally died for knowledge. So Odin did exactly that. He took his spear, Gungnir, and drove it through his own body, piercing himself completely. Then he climbed Yggdrasil, the world tree whose branches held the entire cosmos together, and hanged himself from its highest limb. There he remained for 9 days and 9 nights, wounded, starving, dying slowly, staring down into the void that existed between the worlds. This wasn't a peaceful meditation or a symbolic gesture. This was actual, literal torture, self-inflicted in the service of learning. Odin hung there in agony, his life slowly draining away, his consciousness fragmenting under the strain of hunger, thirst, and pain. His own ravens, Hugin and Munin, watched helplessly as their master descended into delirium. On the 9th night, just as his divine essence was about to separate from his physical form permanently, Odin finally saw them. The runes appeared in the darkness below him, glowing with their own inner light. Their secrets finally revealed to someone who had proven worthy through ultimate sacrifice. With the last of his strength, Odin grasped the knowledge of the runes, pulling their power into himself even as he fell from the tree, more dead than alive. But he had succeeded. He now understood the fundamental forces that governed all existence, and more importantly, he could manipulate those forces through runic magic. The knowledge transformed him completely. Odin was no longer just a powerful god. He was a cosmic force in his own right, capable of altering fate itself through his understanding of the rune's power. He could heal the unhealable, see the unseeable, and change the unchangeable. But this power came with a terrible burden. The more he learned about the future, the clearer it became that Ragnarok was not just inevitable, it was necessary. Odin's quest for wisdom didn't end there. If anything, his success with the runes only intensified his hunger for knowledge. He began wandering through all 9 realms, disguised as a simple traveler with a wide-brimmed hat and a walking staff, seeking out anyone who might possess information he hadn't yet acquired. To aid him in this endless quest, Odin had assembled the most comprehensive intelligence network in cosmic history. His ravens, Hugin and Munin, whose names meant thought and memory, flew throughout the realms each day, observing everything that happened anywhere in existence. Each evening they returned to whisper their discoveries into Odin's ears, ensuring that nothing of importance escaped his attention. But ravens, no matter how intelligent, could only observe. For more direct intervention, Odin relied on his wolves, Geri and Freki, savage beasts whose loyalty to their master was absolute. These weren't pets or companions, they were extensions of Odin's will, capable of tracking down anyone who possessed knowledge he required and ensuring that they shared it willingly or otherwise. More subtle, but equally effective, were the Valkyries, Odin's supernatural agents who moved freely between the world of the living and the realm of the dead. Officially, their job was to select which warriors would die in battle and escort the worthy ones to Valhalla. Unofficially, they served as Odin's eyes and ears throughout Midgard, reporting on everything from political developments to family gossip that might somehow prove relevant to his cosmic concerns. Through this vast network of supernatural spies and informants, Odin accumulated knowledge at an unprecedented rate. He learned the secret names of every giant, the hidden weaknesses of every monster, the private fears of every god, and the ultimate fate of every hero. He became the repository of all secrets, the living library of cosmic truth. But knowledge, Odin discovered, was a double-edged sword that grew sharper with every truth he uncovered. The more he learned about the future, the more he understood that his own actions in trying to prevent Ragnarok were actually causing it. Every precaution he took, every threat he neutralized, every alliance he forged was another thread in the web of fate that would ultimately strangle everything he was trying to protect. He learned that his own son, Baldur the Beautiful, would die through treachery, and that Baldur's death would trigger the final sequence of events leading to Ragnarok. He learned that Loki, his blood brother and closest friend, would ultimately betray him in the most devastating way possible. He learned that Thor, his mightiest son, would die killing the Midgard serpent, winning the battle but losing his life to poison. Most terrible of all, Odin learned his own fate. He saw himself facing Fenrir the wolf in the final battle, saw the great beast's jaws closing around him, felt his own divine essence being torn apart and devoured. He knew exactly when, where, and how he would die, and he knew there was absolutely nothing he could do to change it. This knowledge didn't break Odin, but it transformed him into something unprecedented in mythological history. A god who understood that even gods were mortal, that even divine power was limited, and that even the wisest being in existence could not escape the consequences of fate. Yet Odin didn't despair or retreat into passive acceptance. Instead, he doubled down on his quest for knowledge, reasoning that if he couldn't prevent Ragnarok, he might at least ensure that something worthwhile would survive it. He began making preparations for the end of the world that wouldn't come for centuries, laying plans that extended far beyond his own death. He gathered the greatest heroes who ever lived into Valhalla, not just to feast and fight, but to train for the final battle that would determine whether anything at all would survive the cosmic destruction to come. He forged alliances with beings who would normally be his enemies, trading favors and information with giants, dwarfs, and even the forces of chaos itself. Most importantly, Odin began teaching selected mortals the knowledge they would need to rebuild civilization after the gods were gone. He shared the secrets of agriculture, craftsmanship, governance, and magic with human heroes who would carry these gifts into whatever world emerged from Ragnarok's ashes. In pursuing ultimate knowledge, Odin had discovered ultimate responsibility. He couldn't save himself. He couldn't save his fellow gods. And he couldn't save the cosmic order he had helped create. But he could ensure that the sacrifice of the gods would have meaning, that their destruction would purchase something valuable for whatever came after. This was Odin's true achievement and his ultimate tragedy. In seeking the power to control fate, he had gained the wisdom to accept it. In trying to save everything, he had learned to let go of everything. In becoming the wisest being in existence, he had discovered that wisdom's greatest lesson was knowing when to surrender. The All-Father had paid the ultimate price for ultimate knowledge, and that knowledge had taught him that some prices are worth paying, even when you know they will destroy you. Chapter 4. The Thunder God's Rage. Picture Thor waking up one morning to discover that his hammer, the most feared weapon in all of existence, has vanished from beside his bed. Not misplaced, not borrowed, completely gone. Now imagine that same god of thunder having to dress up in a wedding gown, complete with bridal veil and jewelry, to get it back. Yes, this actually happened. And yes, it gets even more ridiculous from there. But before we dive into Thor's most embarrassing adventure, we need to understand what made this god so fundamentally different from his wisdom-obsessed father. Where Odin collected knowledge like other beings collected trinkets, Thor collected enemies like a particularly violent hobby. Where Odin saw complex political situations requiring delicate maneuvering, Thor saw problems that could be solved by hitting them really, really hard with a magical hammer. This wasn't stupidity. This was purity of purpose, taken to its logical extreme. Thor had identified his role in the cosmic order, the eternal protector of gods and humans alike. And he pursued that role with the kind of single-minded determination that made him simultaneously the most beloved and most feared god in the Norse pantheon. His weapon, Mjolnir, wasn't just a hammer in the way that Excalibur was just a sword. This was a cosmic force given physical form, forged by the master craftsmen of Svartalfheim, using materials that existed at the intersection of multiple realities. When Thor threw Mjolnir, it didn't just strike its target. It struck the very concept of that target, dealing damage that transcended mere physical harm. The hammer could level mountains, shatter the foundations of reality itself, and most impressively, always return to Thor's hand, no matter how far he threw it, or what obstacles stood in its path. It would tear through solid rock, bend around corners, and if necessary, wait patiently for Thor to call it back across time itself. But Mjolnir was just one part of Thor's arsenal. His belt, Megingjörd, doubled his already incredible strength, making him capable of feats that impressed even other gods. His iron gloves, Jerngriper, allowed him to grasp his hammer's handle, which was so charged with divine energy that it would burn the flesh from anyone else's hands. More than his equipment, though, Thor's true power lay in his absolute, unwavering commitment to protecting those who couldn't protect themselves. He didn't fight for glory or conquest or political advantage. He fought because there were monsters in the world, and monsters needed to die. And he was very, very good at killing monsters. This philosophy led to some of the most spectacular battles in mythological history. Take his ongoing feud with the giant Hrungnir, a creature so arrogant that he challenged Thor to single combat and actually expected to win. Hrungnir was massive even by giant standards, armed with a shield and club made from solid stone, and absolutely convinced that his size and strength made him invincible. The two titans met on neutral ground, with Hrungnir taking a defensive position behind his stone shield, while Thor approached with Mjolnir crackling with lightning. What followed wasn't so much a fight as a demonstration of why challenging Thor to single combat was universally considered a form of elaborate suicide. Thor hurled his hammer with such force that the sound of its flight shattered windows in nearby realms. Hrungnir, realizing perhaps a moment too late that he had made a terrible mistake, threw his own stone weapon with desperate strength. The two projectiles met in mid-air with a collision that sent shockwaves rippling across multiple dimensions. Hrungnir's stone club shattered into countless fragments, while Mjolnir continued its flight unimpeded, striking the giant directly in the skull and ending the fight instantly. Thor stood victorious, but with one small problem. A shard of Hrungnir's weapon had lodged itself in his forehead, and despite the combined efforts of Asgard's healers, it refused to be removed. This injury became a permanent reminder of the fight, a small price to pay for eliminating a threat to the cosmic order. But more importantly, it established Thor's reputation as a god who would face any enemy, no matter how powerful, if that enemy threatened innocent lives. His most famous adventure, however, had nothing to do with protecting anyone and everything to do with recovering his stolen dignity. The morning Thor woke to find Mjolnir missing ranks as one of the most catastrophic theft attempts in cosmic history, not because of what was stolen, but because of the chain of events it set in motion. Thor's reaction was immediate and volcanic. He stormed through Asgard like a hurricane, demanding answers, threatening vengeance, and generally making it clear that whoever had taken his hammer had made the kind of mistake that ended civilizations. The other gods wisely stayed out of his way, while Loki, ever the problem solver, volunteered to investigate. It didn't take long for Loki to discover the culprit. Thrymer, king of the frost giants, who had somehow managed to steal the hammer while Thor slept and hide it so effectively that even divine magic couldn't locate it. When confronted, Thrymer was smugly unrepentant. He would return the hammer, he announced, but only in exchange for one thing: Freya's hand in marriage. This demand was so outrageous that it temporarily stunned even the gods into silence. Freya, goddess of love and beauty, most powerful practitioner of sadomagic, was being treated like a trading commodity by a giant with delusions of grandeur. Her response was immediate, emphatic, and involved enough divine fury to melt several nearby ice formations. The gods found themselves in an impossible situation. They couldn't retrieve the hammer by force because they couldn't locate where it was hidden. They couldn't negotiate because Thrymer's demand was completely unacceptable. And they couldn't simply abandon Mjolnir because without it, Thor was significantly less capable of protecting Midgard from the various monsters that viewed human civilization as a convenient snack. That's when Heimdall, keeper of the Rainbow Bridge and possessor of cosmic wisdom, proposed the most audacious plan in divine history. If Thrymer wanted a bride, they would give him one, just not the bride he was expecting. The plan was simple in concept and horrifying in execution. Thor would disguise himself as Freya, travel to Jotunheim for the wedding ceremony, and retrieve his hammer during the traditional blessing ritual. It was brilliant, practical, and absolutely guaranteed to traumatize everyone involved. Thor's initial response to this suggestion cannot be repeated in polite company, but it involved several creative uses of divine profanity and at least 3 threats to throw Heimdall into the sun. The idea of the god of thunder, mightiest warrior in Asgard, dressing up as a bride was so fundamentally absurd that it temporarily broke Thor's ability to form coherent sentences. But eventually, grim necessity won out over wounded pride. Mjolnir was too important to leave in giant hands, and this ridiculous plan was the only one anyone could devise that had even a remote chance of success. With great reluctance and even greater embarrassment, Thor allowed himself to be dressed as a bride. The transformation was both impressive and deeply disturbing. The gods draped him in Freya's finest wedding dress, though it strained considerably across his massive shoulders. They covered his distinctive red beard with a bridal veil, hung jewelry around his thick neck, and somehow managed to cram his enormous feet into delicate shoes. Loki naturally volunteered to accompany Thor as his bridesmaid, partly to provide support, and partly because he wouldn't miss this spectacle for anything. The two gods set off for Jotunheim in a chariot pulled by Thor's goats, presenting the most bizarre bridal procession in a mythological history. When they arrived at Thrymir's hall, the giant king was beside himself with joy. Finally, the most beautiful goddess in Asgard would be his wife, cementing his position as the most powerful being in Jotunheim. He threw an enormous feast to celebrate, inviting every giant of importance to witness his triumph. The wedding feast, however, quickly revealed problems with the disguise. Thor, even when trying to be delicate, ate with the appetite of a god who regularly battled cosmic monsters. He consumed an entire ox, ate salmon, and all the delicacies meant for the women guests, then washed it down with 3 barrels of mead. Thrymr, watching his bride devour enough food to feed a small army, began to express concern about his future wife's appetite. Loki, thinking quickly, explained that Freya had been so excited about the wedding that she hadn't eaten for 8 days, which was why she was so hungry now. When Thrymr leaned in to steal a kiss from his bride and caught sight of Thor's eyes blazing with barely contained fury behind the veil, he jumped back in alarm. Those weren't the gentle eyes of a love goddess. They were the eyes of someone contemplating mass murder. Again, Loki stepped in with an explanation. Freya had been so excited about the wedding that she hadn't slept for 8 nights, which was why her eyes burned so fiercely with anticipation. Somehow, these explanations satisfied Thrymr, who was apparently so focused on his political triumph that he failed to notice his bride's massive shoulders, thick arms, and the way she kept glancing around the hall as if calculating the most efficient way to kill everyone present. Finally, the moment of the ceremony arrived. Following ancient tradition, Thrymr ordered Mjolnir brought out and placed in the bride's lap to bless the union with fertility and strength. The hammer was carried in by several giants, who laid it carefully across Thor's knees while chanting traditional blessing songs. The moment Mjolnir touched his hands, Thor's disguise became irrelevant. Divine power flowed through him like lightning through a conductor, restoring his full strength and washing away the humiliation of the past few hours. He stood up, throwing off the wedding dress, and revealed himself in all his terrible glory. What followed wasn't a battle so much as a massacre. Thor's rage at being forced into such an undignified position, combined with his fury at having his hammer stolen in the first place, created a perfect storm of divine retribution. Thrymr died first, crushed by a hammer blow that sent shockwaves through the mountain. The other giants died so quickly that most of them probably never understood what was happening. Within minutes, Thor and Loki were on their way back to Asgard, leaving behind a hall full of dead giants and one very interrupted wedding feast. Thor had his hammer back, his dignity was somewhat restored, and Jotunheim had learned an important lesson about stealing from gods. But the adventure had revealed something crucial about Thor's character. Despite his embarrassment, despite his wounded pride, despite the sheer absurdity of the situation, he had been willing to sacrifice his dignity to recover a weapon that was essential to protecting others. The god of thunder might be proud, but he wasn't too proud to do whatever was necessary to fulfill his responsibilities. This willingness to embrace humiliation for the greater good would define Thor throughout his mythological career. He wasn't the wisest god or the most cunning, but he was absolutely reliable. When monsters threatened the innocent, when giants plotted against the gods, when cosmic disasters loomed on the horizon, Thor would be there, hammer in hand, ready to face whatever needed facing. His adventures established him as more than just a warrior god. He was the divine embodiment of the principle that some things are worth fighting for, no matter the cost to yourself. Protection of the innocent, maintenance of cosmic order, and the simple but profound idea that might should serve right rather than rule through it. The Thunder God's legend was just beginning, but already his character was clear. Thor was the god you called when everything else had failed, when diplomacy was useless, when subtle plans had collapsed, and when only raw, honest force could solve the problem at hand. He was, in every sense, the god of last resorts and final stands, and in a cosmos heading inexorably toward Ragnarok that made him perhaps the most important god of all. Chapter 5. Heroes, Dragons, and the Curse that Doomed Them All. Picture this. A young warrior stands over the corpse of a dragon so massive that its death throes carved new valleys into the earth. In his hands gleams a treasure beyond imagination, gold that could buy kingdoms, weapons that could slay gods, and a single ring whose beauty masks a curse so terrible it will destroy everyone who touches it. The warrior thinks he's won the greatest victory in human history. He has no idea he's just signed his own death warrant. This is the story of Sigurd the Dragon Slayer, and it's about to show you why Norse mythology understood something that most hero stories refuse to admit. Sometimes the greatest victories are actually the most devastating defeats, and sometimes saving the world requires destroying the people you love most. But before we dive into Sigurd's tragic tale, we need to understand something crucial about how Norse mythology treats its heroes. These aren't the clean, morally uncomplicated champions you find in other mythologies. These are complex, flawed, doomed individuals who achieve greatness precisely because they're willing to sacrifice everything, including themselves, for principles that may not even survive their deaths. Norse heroes don't get happy endings. They get meaningful endings, and sometimes that's far more valuable. Sigurd's story begins not with his birth, but with a betrayal that would echo through generations. Long before Sigurd was even conceived, there lived a dwarf named Fafnir, who, along with his father Hreidmar and his brother Regin, possessed a modest treasure that should have brought them nothing but prosperity and happiness. But here's where Norse mythology shows its true genius. It understands that treasure without wisdom is a weapon pointed at your own heart. When the gods, Odin, Loki, and Hönir, accidentally killed Fafnir's brother Otter during their travels, they were forced to pay compensation in the form of enough gold to fill Otter's skin and cover it completely. To obtain this massive amount of gold, Loki captured the dwarf king Andvari and forced him to surrender his entire hoard. But Andvari, in his desperation, tried to keep back one item, a beautiful golden ring that was the source of his wealth-generating power. When Loki noticed and demanded the ring as well, Andvari had no choice but to surrender it, but not before he spoke a curse that would follow that gold forever. "This gold shall be the death of whoever owns it," Andvari declared, his words carrying the weight of absolute prophecy. The ring, and all the treasure connected to it, would bring nothing but destruction to anyone who possessed it, no matter how noble their intentions or pure their heart. The gods delivered the cursed gold to Hreidmar as compensation, and immediately the curse began its work. Fafnir, consumed by greed for the treasure, murdered his own father and drove away his brother Regin. But the gold's corruption didn't stop there. Fafnir's obsession with his hoard was so complete, so all-consuming, that it literally transformed him from dwarf into dragon, a massive, terrible beast whose only purpose was to guard the cursed treasure. For years, Fafnir lay coiled around his gold in a cave that reeked of sulfur and death, growing larger and more monstrous with each passing season. His transformation was complete, no longer dwarf, no longer even truly alive, but something between creature and curse, guardian and prisoner of the very treasure that had destroyed his humanity. This is where Regan, the surviving brother, enters our story with a plan that was either brilliant or insane, depending on your perspective. Unable to reclaim the treasure himself, Fafnir would kill him instantly. Regan decided to raise a hero capable of slaying his dragon brother. He chose Sigurd, a young warrior of exceptional promise, and began training him for this seemingly impossible task. But Regan wasn't acting out of brotherly love or heroic principle. He wanted that treasure for himself and was perfectly willing to manipulate an innocent young hero to get it. In the Norse worldview, this kind of corruption, the way treasure and power can turn even family bonds into weapons, was an inevitable part of the human condition. Sigurd, for his part, was everything a legendary hero should be: brave, strong, noble, and completely unaware that he was being groomed as a tool in someone else's revenge plot. Regan trained him in swordcraft, battle tactics, and the kind of dragon-slaying techniques that most warriors never needed to learn, because most warriors were smart enough to avoid dragons entirely. The first challenge was finding a weapon capable of harming Fafnir. Dragon scales weren't just tough, they were magically reinforced, capable of turning aside any ordinary blade. Sigurd tried several swords, each one shattering against simple stone when tested. Finally, Regan revealed fragments of a broken blade that had once belonged to Sigurd's father, a weapon of such legendary power that even its fragments held more strength than most complete swords. From these pieces, Sigurd reforged a blade he named Gram, a weapon that could cut through anvils as easily as cloth, and whose very presence seemed to hunger for the dragon's blood. With Gram at his side, Sigurd felt ready to face any enemy, no matter how terrible. The battle strategy Regan devised was both clever and cowardly. Rather than facing Fafnir in direct combat, a fight even Sigurd might not survive, they would dig a pit along the dragon's regular path to water, then wait for the beast to pass overhead. When Fafnir's soft belly was exposed, Sigurd would strike upward with Gram, piercing the dragon's heart before it even realized it was under attack. The plan worked perfectly, which should have been Sigurd's first warning that something was wrong. In Norse mythology, when plans work too well, it usually means fate is setting up something far more terrible than anything you were trying to avoid. Fafnir, mortally wounded, had just enough life left to warn Sigurd about the curse that came with the treasure. "The gold will be your death," the dying dragon whispered, "as it was mine, as it will be for anyone who claims it." But Sigurd, drunk on victory and overwhelmed by the sight of more wealth than he had ever imagined, dismissed the warning as the bitter words of a defeated enemy. What happened next reveals the Norse understanding of how knowledge and power actually work in the real world. As Sigurd cooked and ate Fafnir's heart, a ritual that would grant him wisdom, he accidentally tasted the dragon's blood and suddenly gained the ability to understand the language of birds. The birds immediately began warning him about Regan's true intentions. His mentor, they chirped frantically, was planning to murder Sigurd the moment the treasure was secured. Regan had never intended for Sigurd to survive this adventure. The young hero was just a tool to be discarded once he'd served his purpose. Faced with this betrayal, Sigurd made the kind of pragmatic decision that defines Norse heroes. He killed Regan before Regan could kill him. It wasn't pretty, it wasn't noble, but it was necessary. The mentor who had raised him, trained him, and shaped him into a hero had become just another obstacle to be overcome. With both dragon and treacherous mentor dead, Sigurd claimed the cursed treasure and began the next phase of his story, the part where everything he had won would slowly destroy everything he loved. The curse didn't work through obvious supernatural means. It didn't summon demons or cause plagues. Instead, it worked through the subtle corruption of human relationships. The way wealth and power can poison even the purest love and turn loyalty into betrayal. Sigurd fell in love with Brynhild, a Valkyrie who had been stripped of her divine status and imprisoned in a ring of fire as punishment for defying Odin. Their love was genuine, pure, and absolutely doomed from the moment it began. The cursed gold ensured that misunderstanding, jealousy, and manipulation would transform their perfect love into perfect tragedy. Through a complex series of magical deceptions involving memory-altering potions, Sigurd was tricked into marrying Gudrun instead of Brynhild, while Brynhild was forced into marriage with Gudrun's brother Gunnar. Neither Sigurd nor Brynhild understood what had happened to them. They only knew that their love had somehow been stolen and twisted into something that caused constant pain. The curse worked its way through their lives like poison through blood. Brynhild, convinced that Sigurd had betrayed her willingly, orchestrated his murder through the same kind of manipulation that had destroyed their love in the first place. Sigurd died never fully understanding how his greatest victory had become his doom, killed by people he loved because of treasure he had won fairly. But the curse wasn't finished. Gudrun, mad with grief over her husband's death, eventually remarried to Atli, a king whose greed for Sigurd's treasure would lead him to murder Gudrun's brothers and drive her to revenge so terrible it would become legendary, even in a culture that appreciated creative vengeance. In the end, everyone connected to Fafnir's treasure died violently, their deaths rippling outward to destroy families, kingdoms, and entire bloodlines. The gold that should have brought prosperity brought only death. The ring that should have symbolized love became a token of betrayal. And the hero who should have lived happily ever after became another victim of the very evil he had tried to destroy. This is what makes Sigurd's story so profoundly Norse. It doesn't pretend that good intentions are enough to guarantee good outcomes. It doesn't suggest that heroes are immune to the consequences of their choices. And it absolutely refuses to pretend that winning means anything if you lose yourself in the process. Sigurd was a true hero, brave, noble, and willing to face any danger to protect others. But he was also human, which meant he was vulnerable to the same forces of greed, pride, and misunderstanding that destroy ordinary people. His greatness didn't make him immune to tragedy. It just made his tragedy more significant. The story of Sigurd and the cursed treasure became one of the most beloved tales in Norse culture because it captured something essential about the human condition. We are all fighting battles we don't fully understand, against enemies we can't always see, for prizes that may destroy us even if we win. But that doesn't mean the battle isn't worth fighting. Sigurd's death was tragic, but his courage was real. His love was corrupted, but it was genuine while it lasted. His victory was hollow, but the dragon was still dead, and the world was still safer for his actions. This is the Norse way of understanding heroism, not as a guarantee of happiness, but as a commitment to doing what's right regardless of the personal cost. Heroes don't get to control the consequences of their actions, but they do get to choose their actions. And sometimes, that choice is the only victory that matters. Sigurd's legend would inspire countless other heroes, warriors who understood that the dragon always comes with a price, that treasure always carries a curse, and that sometimes the most heroic thing you can do is accept that your story won't have a happy ending. Because in a cosmos heading toward Ragnarok, where even the gods were doomed, the only real victory was making sure that your sacrifice meant something. Sigurd achieved that victory, even if it killed him. And in Norse mythology, that was often the best any hero could hope for. Chapter 6. The Death of Light Itself. Imagine the most beloved person you've ever known, someone whose mere presence could lift spirits, heal arguments, and make even the darkest days feel manageable. Now imagine that person having nightmares, terrible dreams of violence and death that they can't shake. Then imagine watching helplessly as those nightmares come true in the most unexpected, devastating way possible, triggered by the one person you should have been able to trust completely. This is the story of Baldur's death, the moment when light itself died in Norse mythology, and it's about to show you how a single act of jealousy can unravel the fundamental order of existence. But here's what makes this tragedy so devastating. It wasn't inevitable. It wasn't fate or destiny or the unavoidable will of the gods. It was a choice made by someone who should have known better, someone who had been shown love and friendship, and who chose to repay those gifts with the ultimate betrayal. Balder wasn't just another god. He was the divine embodiment of everything good about existence: beauty, purity, joy, and hope, made manifest in divine form. When he walked through Asgard, flowers bloomed in his footsteps. When he spoke, even bitter enemies found themselves smiling. When he laughed, the sound carried across all 9 realms like music made from pure happiness. He was Odin's son, but unlike his father, Balder had no interest in dark wisdom or terrible sacrifices. He was Frigg's child, but unlike his mother, he didn't weave complex fates or manipulate destinies. Balder was simply purely good in a way that seems almost impossible in Norse mythology's typically dark and complex moral universe, and everyone loved him for it. Gods and giants, dwarfs and elves, even the usually grim Einherjar warriors in Valhalla would break into spontaneous celebration whenever Balder appeared. He was living proof that existence could be joyful, that power could be used for kindness, that strength could serve love instead of conquest, which is exactly why his death was so catastrophic. When you kill the embodiment of hope, you don't just commit murder, you perform a cosmic surgery, cutting the heart out of existence itself. The nightmare began with dreams, terrible visions that plagued Balder's usually peaceful sleep. Night after night, he saw images of violence, betrayal, and death. Not the glorious death in battle that Norse warriors dreamed of, but something senseless, unexpected, and wrong in ways that seemed to violate the fundamental laws of how reality should work. These weren't just bad dreams. In Norse mythology, dreams were communications from fate itself, messages from the cosmic forces that shaped existence. When a god as pure as Balder began having prophetic nightmares about his own death, it meant something had gone fundamentally wrong with the universe's moral structure. Frigg, Balder's mother and the wisest of the goddesses, understood immediately what these dreams meant. Her son was in genuine danger, threatened by forces that she couldn't identify, but absolutely had to stop. So she undertook the most ambitious magical project in divine history. She would make her son invulnerable to all harm. Frigg traveled through all 9 realms, speaking personally to every living thing and every inanimate object. She extracted promises from fire and water, from stone and iron, from plants and animals, from diseases and weapons. Everything in existence swore a sacred oath never to harm Balder, binding themselves with the kind of magical compulsion that couldn't be broken even by gods. The project was exhaustive, comprehensive, and seemingly perfect. Balder became literally invulnerable, immune to all forms of damage, protected by the collective will of all existence. Swords bounced off his skin, fire refused to burn him, poison turned harmless in his presence, and even gravity seemed reluctant to let him fall. The gods, delighted by this development, invented a new game. They would gather in Asgard's great hall and throw weapons at Balder, laughing joyfully as everything harmlessly bounced away from him. It became a celebration of invincibility, a daily reminder that at least one good thing in the universe was safe from harm. But there was one person who wasn't laughing. One god who watched these celebrations with growing irritation, jealousy, and something darker than either of those emotions. Loki, the trickster god, the shapeshifter who had never quite fit in anywhere, watched his fellow gods celebrate Balder's invulnerability and felt something ugly growing in his heart. This wasn't simple envy, though that was part of it. Loki had always been an outsider among the gods, tolerated for his usefulness, but never truly beloved the way Balder was beloved. He was clever where Balder was kind, cunning where Balder was honest, useful where Balder was simply good. But more than jealousy, Loki felt a kind of cosmic irritation at the very idea of invulnerability. In his view, nothing should be completely safe. Nothing should be beyond the reach of change and chance and chaos. Balder's protection represented a kind of order that Loki found fundamentally offensive to his nature as a force of transformation and unpredictability. So Loki decided to do what Loki always did when confronted with something he didn't like. He decided to break it. Disguising himself as an old woman, one of his favorite deceptions, Loki approached Frigg and engaged her in conversation about her son's remarkable protection. Frigg, proud of her achievement and secure in its completeness, spoke freely about how she had extracted promises from everything in existence to never harm Balder. But in her pride, she revealed one crucial detail. There had been one thing she hadn't bothered to ask for a promise from: mistletoe. It was such a small, harmless plant, she explained. Too young and weak to pose any threat to anyone, let alone a god as powerful as Balder. Loki's eyes lit up with dark delight. He had found his weapon. Mistletoe, in Norse mythology, occupied a unique position in the natural order. It wasn't quite plant and wasn't quite parasite, growing on other trees without truly being part of them. It existed in the spaces between categories, neither fully alive nor truly dead, which gave it a kind of magical neutrality that allowed it to slip through even the most comprehensive protections. Loki gathered mistletoe carefully, crafting it into a small dart with the kind of precision that only comes from absolute malicious intent. This wasn't a weapon forged from hatred or anger. It was a tool created from pure, calculated spite, designed for no purpose other than to destroy something beautiful, simply because it could be destroyed. Returning to the great hall where the gods continued their game of throwing weapons at Balder, Loki approached Herder, Balder's blind brother, who stood apart from the celebration, unable to participate in the fun because he couldn't see to aim properly. "Why don't you join in honoring your brother?" Loki asked with false sympathy. "Here, let me help you aim." He placed the mistletoe dart in Herder's hand and guided his arm toward Balder. What happened next was the single most catastrophic moment in Norse mythology. The tiny dart flew straight and true, piercing Balder's heart and killing him instantly. The god of light, joy, and hope collapsed without a sound, his divine radiance fading from his eyes as his spirit departed for the realm of the dead. The silence that followed was absolute. For a moment that stretched into eternity, the gods simply stared at Balder's lifeless form, unable to process what they were seeing. Then came the screaming. Frigg's wail of grief shattered the air itself. Odin's roar of rage shook the foundations of Asgard. The other gods stood paralyzed by shock and horror, watching their golden age die along with the god who had embodied its best qualities. Herder stood over his brother's body in complete bewilderment, the mistletoe dart still in his hand, unable to understand how such a small, harmless thing could have done what the mightiest weapons in existence could not. He had been used, manipulated, turned into an instrument of fratricide without his knowledge or consent. But Loki was nowhere to be seen. The trickster had vanished the moment the dart found its mark, knowing that his role in the tragedy would soon be discovered, and that the god's vengeance would be swift and terrible. The immediate response was chaos. Gods who had lived for millennia without experiencing real loss suddenly found themselves confronted with grief so profound it threatened to tear apart their divine nature. Balder's wife, Nanna, died of heartbreak on the spot, unable to exist in a world without her husband's light. Odin, despite his vast wisdom and knowledge of fate, refused to accept his son's death as final. He immediately dispatched Hermoda, another of his sons, on a desperate mission to Hel's realm to negotiate for Balder's return. If death could be bargained with, if even the fundamental laws of existence could be bent through persuasion or threat, then perhaps this tragedy could still be undone. Hermoda rode Odin's 8-legged horse, Sleipnir, through the treacherous paths that led to the realm of the dead, facing dangers and obstacles that would have destroyed lesser beings. When he finally reached Hel's dark hall, he found Balder sitting in the place of honor, still radiant despite being dead, still beloved even in the underworld. Hel, the half-living goddess of the dead, listened to Hermoda's desperate plea with the kind of cold patience that comes from watching countless souls enter her realm and never leave. She was not unmoved by the gods' grief, but she was also not swayed by their desperation. Finally, she spoke. If all things in existence truly love Balder as much as you claim, then let them prove it. If every living thing and every object weeps for his death, I will release him back to the world of the living. But if even one thing refuses to shed tears for him, he remains here forever. It was a test that seemed impossible to fail. Balder was universally beloved, mourned by every creature that had ever encountered his light. Surely all existence would weep for such a loss. The gods immediately sent messengers throughout all 9 realms, calling on everything that lived or had ever lived to weep for Balder's death. And miraculously, everything did. Humans wept, animals wept, plants drooped in sorrow, even stones shed moisture in their grief. The entire cosmos mourned the death of light itself. But in a remote cave in Jotunheim, the messengers encountered an ancient giantess named Thok, who refused to weep. Let Hel keep what she has, the crone said coldly. Balder never brought me joy while he lived. Why should I mourn him now that he's dead? With that single refusal, Balder's fate was sealed. He would remain in Hel's realm until Ragnarok, his light extinguished from the world, just when it was needed most. What the gods didn't immediately realize was that Thok was Loki in disguise, ensuring that his crime would have permanent consequences. The trickster had not only murdered the best of the gods, he had made certain that death would be irreversible. When this final betrayal was discovered, the gods' patience with Loki finally snapped completely. They hunted him down despite his shape-shifting abilities, his clever words, and his desperate flight. When they caught him, their punishment was as creative as it was cruel. They bound Loki to a rock with chains made from his own son's entrails, positioning a venomous serpent above his head so that poison would drip constantly onto his face. His loyal wife Sigyn remained by his side, catching the poison in a bowl. But whenever she had to empty the bowl, the venom would strike Loki again, causing him such agony that his struggles would shake the earth itself. This was Loki's punishment for destroying the light of the world. Eternal torture, with brief moments of relief that only made the pain more unbearable when it returned. He would remain bound until Ragnarok, when he would break free to lead the forces of chaos against the gods who had imprisoned him. Balder's death marked the end of the Golden Age in Norse mythology. The gods had lost their innocence, their trust in each other, and their faith that good things could be protected simply by being good. The cosmic order had been revealed as fundamentally fragile, vulnerable to destruction through the actions of anyone willing to pay the price for causing chaos. More than that, Balder's death was the first domino in the chain of events that would lead to Ragnarok. Without the god of light and hope, the universe became a darker place, more prone to despair, conflict, and the kind of moral corruption that would eventually consume even the gods themselves. The lesson of Balder's death wasn't that good things don't last. It was that evil requires only indifference to flourish. Loki's crime wasn't a moment of passion or a tragic mistake. It was a deliberate choice to destroy something beautiful, simply because he had the power to do so. In killing Balder, Loki didn't just commit murder. He performed a cosmic act of vandalism, defacing the universe itself out of petty jealousy and spite. And the consequences of that act would echo through every story that followed. A constant reminder that even in a world of gods and magic, the greatest threats often come not from external enemies, but from the darkness within ourselves. The light had died. Winter was coming. And somewhere in his cave, bound and tortured but not broken, Loki waited for the day when he could finish what he had started. Chapter 7. When the world began to die. Imagine waking up one morning to discover that winter has come and it will never end. Not the kind of winter where you complain about your heating bill or worry about icy roads. I'm talking about the kind of winter that kills crops, freezes rivers solid, and turns the sky into a grey shroud that never lifts. A winter so brutal, so endless, that people begin eating their own children just to survive one more day. Now imagine that this isn't just bad weather. This is the universe itself beginning to die. And everyone, gods, giants, humans, even the cosmic forces that hold reality together, knows that something far worse is coming. Something so terrible that eternal winter is just the opening act. This is the Fimbulwinter, the beginning of the end, the first movement in a symphony of destruction that will culminate in Ragnarok itself. And what makes it truly terrifying isn't just the cold or the hunger or the darkness. It's the way it strips away every pretense of civilization, every comfortable lie we tell ourselves about human nature, revealing exactly what we become when hope dies and survival is all that's left. But before we dive into humanity's darkest hour, we need to understand how Baldur's death had fundamentally broken something in the cosmic order. You see, when light itself dies, it doesn't just make things darker, it makes them colder, harder, more brittle. The death of the god of joy and hope had created a kind of spiritual vacuum in the universe, and nature abhors a vacuum. In the months following Baldur's murder and Loki's imprisonment, subtle changes began rippling through all 9 realms. Summers grew shorter and less warm. Winters lingered longer and bit deeper. The aurora borealis, once a beautiful display of cosmic harmony, began to flicker erratically, sometimes disappearing for weeks at a time. More troubling were the changes in behavior. Gods who had once worked together began viewing each other with suspicion. Giants who had maintained uneasy truces with their divine neighbors started testing boundaries, probing for weakness. Even humans, who had always looked to the gods for protection and guidance, began to sense that something fundamental had shifted in the cosmic order. The first real sign that the end was approaching came not from prophecy or divine revelation, but from something much more prosaic: the weather reports. Across Midgard, the human realm, farmers and sailors began noticing patterns that defied everything they understood about seasonal cycles. Spring arrived late and left early. Summer heat never quite managed to penetrate the persistent chill in the air. Autumn harvests were smaller each year, as if the earth itself was growing tired of producing life. And winter became something altogether more vicious than it had ever been before. But the Fimbulwinter that would herald Ragnarok wasn't just an unusually harsh season. It was a cosmic event, a fundamental alteration in the way reality itself functioned. When it finally began, it didn't announce itself with dramatic fanfare or supernatural phenomena. It simply started snowing one day in late autumn, and then it never stopped. At first, people told themselves it was just an early winter, maybe a particularly severe one. They had survived hard seasons before. They knew how to ration food, how to conserve fuel, how to huddle together for warmth and wait for spring's eventual return. But spring didn't return. The snow kept falling, day after day, week after week, month after month. The sun, when it could be seen at all through the perpetual cloud cover, seemed smaller and more distant, as if it too was retreating from the world it could no longer properly warm. Rivers froze solid from surface to bottom. Lakes became sheets of ice so thick that even the gods' weapons could barely crack them. The sea itself began to freeze at its edges, extending sheets of ice farther and farther from shore until entire coastlines were locked in crystalline death. But the true horror of the Fimbulwinter wasn't the cold itself. It was what the cold did to the people who had to survive it. Food supplies that should have lasted through a normal winter were exhausted within months. Livestock froze to death in their shelters. Crops that hadn't been harvested before the snows began were lost forever beneath drifts that never melted. As the first year of winter dragged on with no sign of spring, desperation began to set in. Families that had lived as neighbors for generations started eyeing each other's dwindling supplies with calculating hunger. Communities that had shared resources freely began hoarding everything from grain to firewood, preparing for sieges that might last forever. The breakdown of social order was gradual but inexorable. First went the customs of hospitality that had defined civilized behavior for centuries. Strangers were no longer welcomed with food and shelter. They were driven away as threats to survival, additional mouths that couldn't be fed. Then went the bonds of extended family, as cousins and in-laws found themselves competing for resources that might mean the difference between life and death. By the second year of perpetual winter, even closer relationships began to fracture. Brothers fought over inheritance that hadn't yet been inherited. Parents looked at their own children and made calculations that would have been unthinkable in better times. Children learned to hide food from their siblings, to lie about what they had found or saved or stolen. The violence started small, arguments over firewood that escalated into fistfights, disputes over hunting grounds that ended with blood in the snow. But as the third year of winter ground on without mercy, the violence became systematic, purposeful, and utterly ruthless. Entire families were murdered for their stored food. Villages went to war against neighboring villages over access to frozen rivers where fish might still be caught. Armies of desperate survivors roamed the countryside like packs of wolves, taking what they needed from anyone too weak to resist and killing anyone who might later seek revenge. This wasn't the honorable warfare that Norse culture had traditionally celebrated, where brave warriors died gloriously in service to their lords and their gods. This was survival warfare, where victory meant living another day and defeat meant watching your children starve. There was no honor in it, no glory, no songs to be sung about heroic deeds. There was only hunger, cold, and the terrible arithmetic of who would die so that others might live. The worst part wasn't even the violence itself. It was how quickly people adapted to it, how efficiently they learned to think in terms of resources and threats rather than neighbors and friends. The Fimbulwinter didn't just freeze the world, it froze the human heart, turning compassion into a luxury that nobody could afford. Some tried to maintain the old ways, the old bonds of kinship and community that had defined civilization since humans first learned to live together. These were often the first to die, their kindness and generosity making them easy targets for those who had already embraced the brutal logic of unlimited competition. Others retreated into smaller and smaller circles of trust, protecting only their immediate families or even just themselves, viewing everyone else as potential threats to be eliminated before they could become actual threats. These survivors lasted longer, but at the cost of becoming something barely recognizable as human. And through it all, the snow kept falling, the wind kept howling, and the sun, when it could be glimpsed at all, continued its steady retreat from a world it seemed to have given up on entirely. The gods, watching this horror unfold from their halls in Asgard, found themselves facing their own crisis of purpose and meaning. They had always justified their rule over the cosmos by claiming to protect the innocent and maintain cosmic order. But what were they protecting now? What order remained to maintain? Odin, whose ravens brought him daily reports of the atrocities being committed across Midgard, began to understand that the Fimbulwinter wasn't just a harsh season, it was a test of everything the gods claimed to stand for, and they were failing that test catastrophically. Thor still rode out to battle frost giants and other monsters that threatened what remained of human civilization. but his victories felt increasingly hollow. What was the point of protecting people who were already dead inside, who had traded their humanity for a few more days of biological existence? Frigg wove fate threads desperately, trying to find some pattern, some possibility that might lead to a better outcome. But every thread she followed led to the same destination. Ragnarok, the final battle, the end of everything. Even Loki, bound and tortured in his cave, suffering constant agony from the serpent's venom, found himself disturbed by the reports his wife Sigyn brought him of what was happening in the world above. He had wanted to bring chaos to the cosmic order, but this wasn't chaos. This was entropy, the slow dissolution of everything that made existence meaningful. As the Fimbulwinter entered its 4th year, even the most optimistic observers began to accept that this wasn't a season that would eventually end. It was the new permanent condition of the world. The old cycles of death and rebirth, winter and spring, hardship and renewal had been broken beyond repair. But the Fimbulwinter was just the opening movement in a much larger symphony of destruction. In the frozen wastelands that had once been fertile farmlands, in the ice-locked harbours that had once welcomed trading ships from distant realms, in the abandoned ruins of cities where families had once lived in peace and prosperity, something else was stirring. The giants of Jotunheim, who had always been kept in check by the implicit threat of divine retribution, began to sense that the gods were distracted, weakened by their failure to prevent or stop the cosmic winter. Ancient grudges that had been suppressed for centuries began to resurface. Old alliances that had maintained the balance of power between order and chaos started to fracture. In the deepest caves and darkest forests, creatures that had hidden from the light for millennia began to emerge, sensing that their time was finally coming. The barriers between realms that had kept different types of beings in their proper places began to weaken, allowing dangerous things to slip through cracks in reality itself. Most ominous of all, in his prison cave, Loki felt his bonds beginning to loosen, not through any conscious effort on his part. The chains forged from his own son's entrails were too strong for that, but through the gradual erosion of the cosmic forces that held them in place. As order collapsed throughout the 9 realms, even the most fundamental magical constraints began to weaken. And Loki knew, with the terrible clarity that comes from having orchestrated this entire sequence of events, that when his bonds finally snapped, the Fimbulwinter would be revealed as merely the prelude to something infinitely worse. The end times weren't coming. They were already here. The only question now was whether anything at all would survive the final reckoning that was about to begin. In houses that no longer had heat, around fires that could no longer be lit, parents told their children stories of the old days when summer existed, and food was plentiful, and people could afford to be kind to strangers. These stories were becoming myths even as they were told. Tales of a golden age that seemed as fantastical as any legend about gods and giants. The children listened with the wide eyes of those who have never known anything but winter, who can barely imagine a world where flowers bloom and birds sing and the sun provides more than just a pale disk in a grey sky. To them, the Fimbulwinter wasn't a catastrophe. It was simply the way the world worked. And perhaps that was the most terrifying thing of all about the approaching end times. How quickly people could adapt to horror, how efficiently they could learn to call catastrophe normal, how easily they could forget that things had ever been different, or could ever be different again. The Fimbulwinter had done more than freeze the world. It had frozen hope itself, turning it into something brittle and fragile that shattered at the slightest touch. And without hope, without the belief that suffering might eventually end and joy might eventually return, people became capable of absolutely anything, which was exactly what would be required for the final battle that was about to begin. The frozen corpses of children lay stacked like cordwood outside what had once been a prosperous farmhouse, their small bodies preserved perfectly in the endless winter that had consumed the world. Inside, Their parents sat motionless around a cold hearth, staring at nothing, their minds finally broken by the weight of choices no human should ever have to make. This wasn't just another harsh season. This was the systematic dismantling of everything that made existence bearable, the methodical destruction of hope itself. And in a cave deep beneath the earth, something that had been bound in agony for years felt the first of its chains begin to crack. The Fimbulwinter had accomplished something that no army, no plague, no natural disaster had ever managed. It had turned humans into something else entirely, something that barely deserved the name. The transformation wasn't sudden or dramatic. It was a slow erosion of everything that separated civilization from savagery, morality from survival, love from appetite. By the 5th year of endless winter, the very concept of law had become meaningless. What court could convene when judges froze to death in their halls? What justice could be administered when the only crime that mattered was having something others needed? The elaborate social structures that had taken centuries to build crumbled in a handful of seasons, leaving behind only the most primitive relationships. Predator and prey, hunter and hunted, the quick and the dead. Trade routes that had connected distant kingdoms became hunting grounds where merchant caravans were slaughtered for their goods before they could travel a single day's journey. Cities that had stood for generations were abandoned as their populations fled to the countryside in search of food, leaving behind empty shells of stone and timber that filled slowly with snow and silence. The great halls, where kings had once held court, became refuges for whoever could seize them and hold them against all comers. Noble bloodlines that had ruled for centuries meant nothing when a peasant with a sharp blade and empty belly could end a dynasty with a single thrust in the dark. But perhaps most disturbing of all was how quickly children adapted to this new reality. Those born during the Fimbulwinter knew nothing of summers or harvests, or the simple pleasure of enough food to eat. They grew up learning that other people were resources to be exploited or threats to be eliminated, that kindness was weakness, that trust was a luxury that could get you killed. These children didn't play games about heroes and adventures. They played games about who could steal the most food without being caught, who could lie most convincingly to adults, who could hide best when the raiders came. They learned to sleep with one eye open and to never ever trust anyone completely, not even their own siblings. Meanwhile, in the divine realms, the gods found themselves facing a crisis that their vast powers seemed utterly inadequate to address. They could battle giants and monsters, they could forge magical weapons and weave protective spells, but they couldn't make the sun shine brighter, or the snow stop falling, or the human heart remember what it meant to be compassionate. Odin's ravens returned each day with reports that grew progressively more horrific. Hugin would perch on the All-Father's shoulder and whisper of villages where the last survivors had drawn lots to see who would be eaten first. Munin would describe cities where the dead were stacked in frozen pyramids because the ground was too hard to dig graves and there was no wood left to burn the bodies. These reports tormented Odin in ways that his self-imposed sacrifices never had. He had given up his eye for wisdom, hung himself from Yggdrasil for knowledge of the runes, endured countless trials in his quest to understand the universe's deepest secrets. But all his wisdom, all his knowledge, all his understanding meant nothing in the face of suffering on this scale. Thor still ventured into Midgard to battle the monsters that preyed on human settlements, but his victories felt increasingly meaningless. He could crush frost giants and drive off ice trolls, but he couldn't restore warmth to hearts that had frozen solid with despair. His hammer could shatter mountains, but it couldn't break the cycle of violence that had consumed human civilization. Frigg sat at her spinning wheel, weaving fate threads with desperate intensity, trying to find some pattern that might lead to hope. But every thread she followed, every possibility she explored, led inexorably to the same destination: total collapse, absolute darkness, the end of everything that had ever mattered. Even the other gods began to change under the weight of witnessing such comprehensive suffering. Freya, the god of fertility and abundance, found his powers weakening as the very concepts he embodied became meaningless in a world where nothing could grow. Heimdall's perfect vision became a curse as he was forced to watch atrocities across all 9 realms without being able to prevent them. The divine halls of Asgard, once filled with laughter and celebration, grew quiet and grim. Gods who had spent eternity in joyful fellowship now spoke in whispers, afraid that their voices might carry some new report of horror from the realms below. But the gods weren't the only divine beings affected by the Fimbulwinter's relentless horror. In Jotunheim, the realm of the giants, ancient powers that had slumbered for millennia began to stir with anticipation. The giants had always been the enemies of order, the cosmic forces of entropy and chaos that the gods held in check through superior strength and organization. Now, as they watched civilization collapse under the weight of endless winter, the giants saw opportunity. The humans who had always been protected by the gods were destroying each other with unprecedented efficiency. The gods themselves seemed paralyzed by the scale of suffering they were witnessing. The cosmic order that had kept chaos at bay for eons was cracking like ice under pressure. In the deepest caverns of Jotunheim, giant lords who hadn't stirred from their halls in centuries began to gather their followers and sharpen their weapons. They spoke in voices like grinding glaciers about the day when they would march forth to settle old scores with their divine enemies, about the revenge they would take for insults both real and imagined. Surtur, the fire giant who ruled Muspelheim, felt the flames of his realm burn brighter as the cosmic balance shifted. For eons he had waited in his domain of endless fire, his flaming sword ready for the day when he would be called upon to burn away the old world and clear the ground for whatever might come next. The great serpent Jörmungandr, who encircled Midgard in the depths of the world ocean, began to thrash in his sleep as the poisonous waters around him grew more turbulent. Each movement sent tremors through the earth itself, causing avalanches that buried what few settlements still clung to existence. And in the darkest depths of Hell's realm, among the dishonored dead who had been denied entry to Valhalla or Folkvanga, whispers began to spread of a coming day when the boundaries between life and death would dissolve, when the slain would march alongside the living in a final battle that would determine the fate of existence itself. But it was in a cave far beneath the earth, bound by chains forged from his own son's entrails, that the most significant changes were taking place. Loki, who had endured years of constant agony as poison dripped onto his face from the serpent above, felt something shift in the cosmic forces that held him prisoner. The chains that had bound him so securely for so long were beginning to weaken. Not through any effort on his part. He had long since given up struggling against bonds that had been forged by the gods themselves, using the most powerful magic at their disposal. But the cosmic order that had created those bonds was itself beginning to unravel. Every act of violence committed during the Fimbulwinter, every betrayal of kinship and friendship, every moment when humans chose survival over morality weakened the fundamental forces that held reality together. The gods' power had always depended on the existence of order, law, and meaning in the universe. As those concepts became increasingly meaningless in a world consumed by chaos, the magical constraints they had created began to lose their strength. Loki felt each loosening of his bonds with a mixture of anticipation and something that might have been regret. He had orchestrated this entire sequence of events, from Baldur's death to the coming of the Fimbulwinter, but even he hadn't fully anticipated the scope of the horror that would result. He had wanted to bring chaos to the cosmic order, to shatter the comfortable certainties that the gods used to justify their rule. But what he was witnessing wasn't the creative chaos of transformation and change. It was the destructive entropy of pure dissolution, the kind of ending that left nothing behind to build upon. Still, there was no turning back now. The chains that bound him grew looser with each passing day, and when they finally snapped, Loki knew exactly what he would do. He would gather an army from among the dishonored dead, the monsters that lurked in the spaces between worlds, and the giants who had waited so long for their chance at revenge. He would march on Asgard itself, bringing fire and sword to the halls of the gods who had bound him. He would watch their perfect order burn to ash and bone, their eternal certainties crumble to dust. He would be present at the end of everything, the final witness to the twilight of the gods. But even as these dark thoughts filled his mind, Loki understood that Ragnarok wouldn't be a victory for anyone. The final battle would consume gods and giants alike, leaving behind only silence and emptiness. There would be no winners in the war to end all wars, only degrees of loss. The Fimbulwinter was nearly over, though few recognized the signs. The snow still fell and the wind still howled, but there were subtle changes in the cosmic atmosphere that suggested something even more dramatic was approaching. The aurora borealis, which had flickered weakly for years, began to pulse with strange new colors. Deep reds and violent purples that had never been seen before. Seers and wise women throughout the surviving settlements reported dreams of fire and blood, of great wolves devouring the sun and moon, of serpents rising from the sea to poison the sky itself. These weren't the confused nightmares of minds broken by suffering. They were prophetic visions of events that were about to unfold across all 9 realms. In Valhalla, the Einherjar, who had spent centuries training for the final battle, felt a change in the very air they breathed. Their daily combats became more intense, more desperate, as if they sensed that their long preparation was finally nearing its end. The mead they drank at their evening feasts tasted different, tinged with something that might have been farewell. The Valkyries who served in Odin's hall reported seeing strange omens during their flights over the battlefields of Midgard. Ravens gathered in numbers never seen before, their cawing creating a constant background chorus of lamentation. Wolves howled in broad daylight, their voices carrying impossible distances across the frozen landscape. Most disturbing of all were the reports from the World Tree itself. Yggdrasil, the cosmic ash that connected all 9 realms and served as the axis around which all existence revolved, was showing signs of distress. Its leaves were turning brown, despite the eternal spring that should have kept them green. Its branches creaked and groaned, as if bearing weight too great for even its cosmic strength to support. Nidhugger, the dragon that gnawed constantly at the tree's roots, had increased the intensity of his attacks. The steady grinding of his teeth against the cosmic wood could be heard throughout the realms below, a constant reminder that even the foundations of existence were under assault. The squirrel Ratatoska, who normally carried messages between the eagle at the tree's crown and the dragon at its roots, had fallen silent. No longer did he scamper up and down the great trunk, carrying gossip and insults between the cosmic extremes. Instead, he huddled motionless on a branch halfway between heaven and hell, as if afraid that any movement might cause the entire structure to collapse. These were the signs that the Fimbulwinter was entering its final phase, that the long twilight was about to give way to the dawn of the last day. Soon, the bonds that held the most dangerous forces in the universe would snap completely. Soon, the armies of chaos would march against the bastions of order in a conflict that would make all previous wars seem like children's games. Soon, the gods themselves would take the field in a battle they knew they could not win, fighting not for victory, but for the slim hope that something meaningful might survive the coming conflagration. The Fimbulwinter had prepared the ground by stripping away every illusion about the nature of existence, every comfortable lie about justice and mercy, and the ultimate triumph of good over evil. What remained was the stark truth that had always lurked beneath the surface of reality, that everything ends, that all things pass away, that even the gods themselves are mortal. But the Norse understood something that many other cultures refused to accept, that the inevitability of ending doesn't make the struggle meaningless. If anything, it makes every choice, every stand, every moment of courage or kindness more precious precisely because it cannot last forever. The final battle was coming, and with it, the end of the world as everyone had known it. But the end of one world also meant the possibility of another, and perhaps, just perhaps, that new world might learn something from the ashes of the old. First, though, those ashes would have to be created, and that would require a war unlike any that had ever been fought, a conflict so total and devastating that it would consume the very foundations of existence itself. The chains were almost broken. The armies were almost ready. The final act of the cosmic drama was about to begin, and somewhere in the frozen wasteland that had once been a world full of life and hope, the last survivors huddled around dying fires and waited for an ending that would come whether they were ready or not. Chapter 8, The Shackles shatter and hell itself opens. Picture this. Deep underground, in a cave that reeks of sulfur and despair, a god screams as molten venom eats through his divine flesh for the 10,000th time. Above him, a serpent's fangs drip with poison that could kill mortals with a single drop. But this prisoner is no mortal. This is Loki, the trickster who murdered light itself, and he's been enduring this torture for years without mercy, without respite, without hope of reprieve. His wife sits beside him, catching the venom in a bowl, her love the only thing standing between him and complete madness. But today is different. Today, as another drop of poison burns through his face, Loki feels something that makes him smile despite the agony. The chains forged from his own son's entrails, chains that should have held him until the end of time, are beginning to crack. And when those chains finally snap, every nightmare that has ever haunted the dreams of gods and mortals alike will come flooding into reality at once. This is the moment when Ragnarok truly begins. Not with the Fimbul winter's slow starvation or civilization's gradual collapse, but with the violent eruption of every force of chaos and destruction that the cosmic order has kept locked away since the beginning of time. We're about to witness the opening moves of a war so catastrophic that it will literally tear apart the fabric of existence itself. But here's what makes this moment truly terrifying. Loki's escape isn't just the release of one angry god. It's the signal that every cosmic safeguard, every divine protection, every fundamental law that has kept reality stable is about to fail simultaneously. The universe is about to discover what happens when chaos doesn't just challenge order, it completely overwhelms it. The moment came without warning or ceremony. Sigyn had just emptied her bowl for what felt like the millionth time, and as she turned back to resume her vigil, the first chain snapped with a sound like thunder splitting stone, then the second, then the third. In the space of 3 heartbeats, bonds that had been forged with the most powerful magic the gods possessed simply ceased to exist. Loki rose from the stone slab where he had lain in agony for years, his body crackling with barely contained energy. The constant pain had transformed him, burning away whatever small remnants of loyalty or affection he might once have felt for his former companions in Asgard. What stood in that cave now wasn't the mischievous trickster who had once helped the gods out of difficult situations. This was something far more dangerous, a being with divine power, infinite cunning, and absolutely nothing left to lose. His first act of freedom was surprisingly gentle. He took his wife's face in his hands, looked into eyes that had never once turned away from his suffering, and spoke words that carried the weight of prophecy. "My faithful Sigyn, you have shared my torment long enough. What comes next I must face alone." Sigyn, who had endured years of watching the man she loved suffer unimaginable agony, understood immediately what his words meant. This wasn't just Loki breaking free from prison. This was the beginning of the end of everything. She nodded once, kissed him farewell, and vanished into the shadows, carrying with her the last spark of gentleness that had remained in Loki's heart. Alone in the cave, Loki underwent a transformation that was both physical and spiritual. The years of torture had burned away his capacity for mercy, for doubt, for any emotion other than rage and the desire for revenge. But they had also refined his power, concentrating it into something pure and terrible. When he finally emerged from his prison, he wasn't just free. He was evolved into something that could challenge the gods on their own terms. His first destination wasn't Asgard, though the gods would have expected him to seek immediate revenge against those who had imprisoned him. Instead, Loki travelled to Hel's realm, where his daughter ruled over the dishonored dead with the same cold wisdom that had made her father famous. Hel had been waiting for this moment. Half beautiful and half corpse, she sat on her throne of bones and regarded her father with eyes that held no warmth but infinite understanding. She had always known this day would come, had been preparing for it since the moment Loki was first bound. "Father," she said, her voice carrying the chill of the grave, "your army awaits." What Loki saw when he followed his daughter's gesture would have broken the spirit of any mortal and shaken the resolve of most gods. Stretching out beyond the horizon was a host of the dishonored dead, not the glorious Einherjar who feasted in Valhalla, but the countless souls who had died in shame, treachery, cowardice, or simple bad luck. These were the forgotten casualties of history, soldiers who had broken and fled from battles, criminals who had died unrepentant, victims of murder and betrayal, who had been denied justice in life. They had been gathering in Hel's realm for millennia, growing in number and bitterness, waiting for someone to offer them a chance at revenge against the world that had failed them. But the dead were just the beginning of Loki's forces. From the darkest corners of Jotunheim came the giants who had nursed grudges against the gods for eons. These weren't the relatively civilized giants who occasionally traded or negotiated with Asgard. These were the ancient ones, the primordial forces of chaos and destruction, who remembered when Odin, Vili, and Ve had murdered Ymir to create their ordered cosmos. Leading them was Surtur, the fire giant whose flaming sword had been waiting since the beginning of time for the chance to burn away the old world. Surtur was less a person than a cosmic force given form, the inevitable entropy that would one day consume all ordered creation. His very presence made the air shimmer with heat that could melt stone and boil seas. From the depths of the world ocean came Jörmungandr, the Midgard serpent, whose massive coils had encircled the earth since his birth. The great snake's emergence from his underwater realm sent tsunamis crashing across every coastline, destroying what few human settlements had survived the Fimbul winter. His poison breath began turning the sky itself toxic, creating clouds that would rain death upon everything they touched. And from the frozen wastes came Fenrir, the wolf whose growth had so terrified the gods that they had resorted to trickery to bind him. The great beast had broken free of his magical chains through sheer strength and fury, his jaws now large enough to swallow the sun itself. His howl, when it echoed across the realms, was a sound that spoke of endings, of hunts that would not stop until every last enemy was torn to pieces. These were Loki's children, the monstrous offspring whose very existence had been seen as a threat to cosmic order. Now, finally, they were united with their father in a family reunion that would literally tear apart the foundations of reality. But even this army of gods, giants, monsters, and dishonored dead wasn't the most terrifying aspect of what Loki had unleashed. The true horror was the way his escape had shattered the cosmic barriers that kept different types of destructive forces separate and manageable. Across all 9 realms, things that should have remained hidden began to emerge into the light. Ancient dragons stirred in their treasure hoards, their eyes opening for the first time in centuries as they sensed that the age of heroes was ending. and the time of monsters had begun. Demons that had been banished to the spaces between worlds began seeping back into reality through cracks in the cosmic structure. Dark elves who had been content to remain in their underground realms suddenly found themselves compelled to march toward Asgard, drawn by the promise of seeing the Lightbringers finally brought low. Dwarfs abandoned their forges and workshops, gathering weapons they had never intended to use, preparing for a war that would make all their previous craftsmanship irrelevant. Even the Norns, the three sisters who wove the threads of fate at the base of Yggdrasil, found their work disrupted by the chaos that Loki's freedom had unleashed. The carefully ordered patterns they had maintained for eons began to unravel, replaced by tangles of possibility that led only to destruction and ending. In Asgard, the gods felt the moment of Loki's escape like a physical blow. Heimdall, whose senses could perceive events across all 9 realms, doubled over in agony as his perfect awareness was suddenly flooded with visions of approaching armies, burning cities, and skies torn open by cosmic violence. Odin, despite all his wisdom and foresight, found himself facing the one scenario he had hoped never to confront: a war where victory was not just unlikely, but literally impossible. His ravens returned to him with reports that grew more catastrophic by the hour. Hugin whispered of giants marshalling in numbers beyond counting. Munin spoke of the sea itself rising up in rebellion, carrying serpents and sea monsters toward every inhabited shore. Thor, who had spent his entire existence as the gods' champion against the forces of chaos, realized that all his victories had been merely preliminary skirmishes. The real war was about to begin, and it would be unlike anything he had ever faced. His hammer Mjolnir, which had never failed to return to his hand, suddenly felt heavier, as if it too understood that it was about to be tested beyond its limits. Frigg, who had woven protective fates around her remaining sons, watched in horror as those carefully crafted threads began to snap one by one. The future she could see was no longer a tapestry of possibilities, but a single, inevitable path leading to a battlefield where everyone she loved would die. But perhaps the most chilling moment came when the gods realized that they couldn't simply respond to this threat as they had to previous challenges. This wasn't another giant raid or monster incursion that could be handled by sending Thor with his hammer. This was the cosmos itself turning inside out, every force of destruction that had ever been contained suddenly unleashed at once. The Einherjar in Valhalla, who had trained for centuries for this moment, found their eternal confidence shaken as reports reached them of the enemy they would face. They had prepared to battle giants and monsters, but they hadn't prepared to fight the dishonored dead, warriors like themselves, but twisted by bitterness and shame into something that combined military skill with absolute ruthlessness. Worse, they realized that many of their opponents would be people they had known in life, former comrades who had fallen in disgrace, enemies who had died unrepentant, even family members who had met shameful ends. This wouldn't just be a battle for the fate of the cosmos. It would be personal in ways that made victory feel like defeat, even before the fighting began. As news of the approaching army spread throughout Asgard, the gods faced a crisis that went beyond mere military strategy. They were confronting the fundamental question of what their existence had actually meant, whether all their centuries of rule had accomplished anything more than delaying this inevitable catastrophe. Some argued for negotiation, suggesting that perhaps Loki's grievances could be addressed, his anger appeased through some form of cosmic compromise. These voices were quickly silenced when Heimdall reported that the trickster god had been seen standing atop a mountain of skulls, addressing his army with words that carried across realms. Today we settle every score, answer every slight, repay every injustice. When the sun sets on this day, there will be no gods left to lord over creation, no cosmic order left to pretend that might makes right. Others proposed retreat, abandoning Asgard and the other realms to find some hidden corner of existence where they might wait out the storm. But Odin, whose wisdom had been purchased with his own eye and years of suffering, understood that there was nowhere to run from a war that encompassed all of reality itself. "This is not a battle we can win," he announced to the assembled gods, his single eye reflecting knowledge too terrible to bear. "But it is a battle we must fight, not for victory, but for the meaning that can only come from facing the end with courage intact." And so, the gods began their own preparations for war, knowing that they were planning not for triumph, but for the most meaningful defeat in cosmic history. They would gather their own armies, forge their own alliances, and march onto a battlefield where the best possible outcome was mutual annihilation. The Valkyries received new orders. No longer would they select only the bravest warriors who died in glorious combat. Now they were to gather every soul who had ever died defending something greater than themselves, parents who had died protecting their children, soldiers who had fallen covering their comrades' retreat, even criminals who had found redemption in their final moments. These would be the gods' army in the final battle. Not perfect heroes, but flawed beings who had chosen to do right when it mattered most. It was a fitting force to represent the cosmic order that Loki sought to destroy. Imperfect, contradictory, but ultimately committed to the principle that existence should have meaning beyond mere survival. Meanwhile, across the realms, the few surviving human settlements received visits from figures out of legend. Odin walked among them in his guise as the Wanderer, offering weapons and wisdom to those who would stand against the approaching darkness. Thor appeared at besieged fortresses, his hammer clearing paths of retreat for refugees who would otherwise have been consumed by the advancing chaos. But even as they offered what help they could, the gods understood that humanity's role in the coming battle would be largely symbolic. The real conflict would be between cosmic forces that operated on scales beyond mortal comprehension. Humans would fight and die alongside gods and heroes, but the outcome would be determined by powers that had existed since the beginning of time. As the armies converged on the plain of Vigrid, where prophecy decreed the final battle would be fought, the very air began to crackle with potential violence. The aurora borealis, which had flickered weakly during the Fimbul winter, now blazed across the sky in colours that had never been seen before. Deep crimsons and violent purples that spoke of blood and endings. Yggdrasil itself began to tremble, its cosmic branches swaying despite the absence of any wind. The world tree, which had stood firm through every crisis since creation, was finally beginning to buckle under the weight of the catastrophe that was about to unfold. In her realm of the dead, Hel watched the preparations with eyes that held neither hope nor fear, only the cold certainty that comes from understanding fate's true nature. She alone, among all the powers gathering for battle, knew exactly what the outcome would be, because she alone would survive to rule over whatever remained when the fighting was done. The stage was set, the players assembled, the cosmic dice cast for the final time. Ragnarok had moved beyond prophecy into reality, beyond possibility into inevitability. The twilight of the gods was about to begin, and with it would come the most spectacular ending in mythological history. But first, there would be the battle itself, a conflict so vast and terrible that it would make every previous war seem like a children's game. A confrontation between order and chaos that would determine not just who ruled the cosmos, but whether the cosmos would continue to exist at all. The sun began to dim as Fenrir's jaws stretched wide enough to swallow it. The moon fled across the sky as another cosmic wolf gave chase. The stars themselves began to fall like tears from the face of heaven, each one a light going out forever. And on the plain of Vigrid, two armies faced each other across a battlefield that stretched beyond the horizon, each knowing that when this day was done, the age of gods and heroes would be over forever. The final battle was about to begin. Chapter 9, The Final Dawn, when gods and monsters dance their last. Picture this. The sun is being devoured alive by a wolf the size of a mountain, its dying light casting everything in the color of fresh blood. The moon screams as it's torn from the sky by another cosmic beast, leaving only darkness and falling stars to illuminate the greatest battlefield in the history of existence. And across that field, stretching beyond every horizon, two armies face each other in perfect, terrible silence. Gods and heroes on one side, monsters and the dishonored dead on the other, all knowing that when this day ends, literally nothing will remain the same. This isn't just the final battle. This is the moment when existence itself discovers whether meaning can survive the complete collapse of everything that once seemed permanent. This is Ragnarok, and you're about to witness how even the gods can die with dignity when there's nothing left to lose but the principles they choose to die for. On the plain of Vigrid, where prophecy had always decreed this moment would come, the two greatest armies ever assembled stood motionless in the pre-dawn darkness. The very ground beneath their feet had been transformed by the weight of so much concentrated divine and monstrous power. What had once been ordinary earth now pulsed with veins of light and shadow, as if reality itself was holding its breath. On one side stood the forces of order, though calling them that seemed almost inadequate for what they truly represented. These weren't just warriors or even gods. They were the living embodiment of every principle that had ever suggested existence might have purpose beyond mere survival. At their head rode Odin, the All-Father, mounted on his eight-legged horse, Sleipnir, his single eye reflecting not wisdom now, but something far more precious: acceptance. Behind him marched the Einherjar, the chosen slain who had trained for this moment through countless centuries of daily battle in Valhalla's halls. But these weren't the pristine heroes of legend. These were scarred, weathered souls who had learned that true courage isn't the absence of fear. It's the decision to do what's right when you're absolutely terrified. Beside them walked figures that would have seemed impossible in any other context. Humans and gods fighting as equals. Giants who had chosen order over chaos. Even some of the dishonored dead, who had found redemption in their final choice to stand against the void. This was an army united not by species or origin, but by the simple, revolutionary idea that some things were worth dying for. Thor strode among them, Mjolnir crackling with lightning that seemed somehow dimmer than usual, as if even divine power was being drained by the magnitude of what they faced. His red beard was streaked with frost from the endless winter. His eyes held the grim knowledge of his own approaching doom, but his grip on his hammer's handle remained steady as stone. Freyr marched without his legendary sword, having traded it away years ago in a moment of passion that now seemed like cosmic irony. He would face the fire giant Surtur with nothing but his bare hands and his determination to protect the fertility and growth he represented, knowing that his death was not just probable, but prophesied. Tyr walked with them as well, the god of justice and righteous war, his missing hand a permanent reminder that sometimes doing the right thing requires sacrificing part of yourself. He had lost that hand binding Fenrir, and now he would face the consequences of that choice as the great wolf brought his own terrible justice to bear. But across the field, the forces of chaos presented a sight that would have broken the sanity of lesser beings. This wasn't just an army, it was entropy itself, given form and purpose. At its head stood Loki, transformed by years of torment into something that transcended his previous role as mere trickster. His eyes burned with the cold fire of absolute conviction, and when he spoke, his voice carried across the battlefield like thunder. "Today," he announced, his words somehow reaching every ear on that vast plain. "We end the lie that has governed existence since its beginning. We end the pretense that might makes right, that the strong deserve to rule the weak, that suffering has meaning beyond the simple fact that it hurts. Today, we burn it all down and let the universe start over without gods or masters or cosmic orders that pretend to know better than the chaos they suppress." Behind him writhed his monstrous children, each one a cosmic force that defied every law the gods had ever established. Jörmungandr, the Midgard serpent, had raised his massive head above the battlefield, his poison breath already beginning to turn the air itself toxic. Every exhale sent clouds of venom drifting across the field, forcing even divine beings to cover their faces or risk being consumed by toxins that could kill gods. Fenrir stood beside his father. The great wolf's jaws opened wide enough to swallow entire armies. Saliva that glowed with its own malevolent light dripped from fangs the size of ancient trees, each drop burning holes in the ground where it fell. His eyes held not animal cunning, but divine intelligence twisted by years of betrayal and imprisonment into something that understood exactly what kind of justice it was about to deliver. And towering above them all was Surtur, the fire giant whose very presence made the air shimmer with heat that could melt mountains. His flaming sword, which had waited since the beginning of time for this moment, cast shadows that seemed to move independently of their source. When he finally drew that blade fully from its sheath, the light it produced would be the last thing many would ever see. The army of the dishonored dead stretched beyond counting, rank upon rank of souls who had found in death the courage they had lacked in life. These weren't shambling corpses or mindless undead. They were warriors who had chosen to fight not for glory or victory, but for the simple satisfaction of finally being able to strike back at a universe that had treated them as expendable. For one moment that felt like eternity, the two armies simply stared at each other across the battlefield, each side taking the measure of enemies they had known must come eventually. Gods who had ruled creation since its beginning faced the monstrous forces they had spent eons trying to contain. Heroes who had dreamed of glorious death confronted the reality of fighting battles they were destined to lose. Then Heimdall, the watchman of the gods, raised his horn Gjallarhorn to his lips and blew the note that would signal the beginning of the end. The sound that emerged wasn't just music, it was the death song of the cosmos itself, a vibration that traveled through every realm and reached every being capable of hearing it. The note seemed to hang in the air for an impossible length of time, growing not louder but deeper, until it became less sound than gravitational force, pulling every warrior on that field toward their destiny, whether they were ready or not. And then, with a crash that shattered the silence of eternity, the final battle began. The collision between the two armies was like watching galaxies smash together, but compressed into a single moment of violence so pure it transcended description. Gods and giants, heroes and monsters, the living and the dead, all of them swept together in a tide of cosmic warfare that made every previous conflict seem like a gentle disagreement between friends. Thor charged straight toward Jörmungandr, his ancient enemy, knowing that their battle was as inevitable as the sunrise that would never come again. The thunder god's hammer met the serpent's fangs in a collision that sent shockwaves rippling across dimensions, each blow strong enough to crack the foundations of reality itself. But this wasn't the Thor of legend, the invincible champion who had never met his match. This was a god who knew he was going to die, and that knowledge had freed him from every constraint, except his own determination to make that death meaningful. He fought not for victory, but for the chance to strike one final blow for the principles he had always defended. Jörmungandr, for his part, brought to their battle all the patience of a creature who had waited at the bottom of the ocean for this moment since the day of his birth. Each strike of his massive coils carried the weight of accumulated resentment, the poison of years spent in exile, the bitter satisfaction of finally being able to repay the gods for treating him as a monster from the moment he drew breath. They traded blows that leveled mountains, their battle ranging across the entire battlefield, as neither could gain decisive advantage over the other. Thor's hammer shattered scales the size of shields, while the serpent's fangs carved wounds in divine flesh that should have been invulnerable to any weapon. Meanwhile, Odin faced his own prophesied doom as Fenrir bounded across the battlefield toward him. The great wolf's jaws opened wide enough to swallow the sky itself. The All-Father's spear Gungnir had never missed its target, but he knew with the terrible clarity of absolute foresight that today would be different. "So," Odin said, as the wolf approached, his voice carrying the weight of all his accumulated wisdom. "It comes to this, my ancient enemy, you, who I bound because I feared what you might become, and I, who became exactly what you always said I was, a tyrant who calls his tyranny justice." Buchimi, Fenrir's response was not words, but action, jaws closing around the god who had betrayed him, who had turned him from a creature capable of loyalty into a monster capable only of revenge. Odin's death was swift, but not painless. It carried the weight of every choice he had made, every sacrifice he had demanded, every price he had paid in his relentless quest for wisdom. But even as the All-Father died, his son Vidar stepped forward to claim vengeance, his specially crafted boot, made from leather scraps gathered by humanity throughout its history, pressing against Fenrir's lower jaw, while his hands gripped the upper. The wolf who had devoured wisdom itself was torn apart by the accumulated craftsmanship of every cobbler who had ever lived. A strangely fitting end for a creature destroyed by the mundane devotion of ordinary people. Across the battlefield, Freyr faced Surtur without weapons, without advantages, with nothing but his bare hands and his absolute refusal to let the forces of destruction claim victory without resistance. The fire giant's flaming sword cut through the god of fertility like a hot blade through ice. But even as he died, Freyr's sacrifice brought precious moments for others to continue fighting. Loki found himself facing Heimdall, the god who had watched him with suspicious eyes for centuries, who had always known this day would come. Their battle was personal in ways that transcended the cosmic conflict raging around them. Two beings who had understood each other perfectly and had chosen opposite sides anyway. They struck each other down simultaneously. Loki's blade finding Heimdall's heart at the same moment the Watchman's sword pierced the trickster's chest. They died looking into each other's eyes, seeing reflected there not hatred, but a strange kind of respect for an enemy who had remained true to his principles, even when those principles led to mutual destruction. But the most devastating battle of all belonged to Thor and Jörmungandr, whose conflict had escalated beyond personal combat into something approaching cosmic surgery. The thunder god's hammer finally found its mark, striking the serpent's skull with such force that the sound of impact could be heard in every realm simultaneously. Jörmungandr collapsed, his massive form crushing armies of both sides as he fell, his death throes sending tsunami waves across oceans that had already boiled away. But even as he died, the serpent's final breath released a cloud of poison so concentrated that it killed everything it touched, including Thor himself, who managed exactly 9 steps away from his fallen enemy before the venom overcame even his divine constitution. As god after god fell, as monster after monster was struck down, as hero after hero died for causes that would not survive their deaths, the battlefield began to change. The ground, soaked with divine blood and monster ichor, began to smoke and bubble. The sky, already dark from the devoured sun and moon, began to crack like broken glass. And through those cracks came something that neither army had expected. Surtur's final gambit. The fire that would consume everything that remained when the fighting was done. The flame giant raised his sword high above the battlefield, and from its blade erupted a fire that didn't just burn, it unmade, unraveling the very concepts of matter and energy and replacing them with pure, cleansing flame. The fire spread faster than thought, consuming the living and the dead with equal indifference. Gods and giants, heroes and monsters, the righteous and the damned, all of them burned together in flames that recognized no distinction between order and chaos, good and evil, victory and defeat. Asgard burned, its golden halls collapsing into ash and memory. Midgard burned, its green fields becoming smoke and shadow. Even the other realms, connected by the World Tree's cosmic branches, found themselves consumed by fires that spread like infection through the very structure of reality. Yggdrasil itself, the cosmic ash that had held existence together since the beginning of time, began to burn from its roots to its crown. The great tree that had connected all 9 worlds, that had been the axis around which all existence revolved, was reduced to ember and ash, its destruction severing the bonds that had held the universe in stable form. And when the last flame finally died, when the last ember cooled to nothing, when the last wisp of smoke dissipated into void, what remained was silence. Not the peaceful silence of rest, but the absolute silence of ending, the complete absence of everything that had ever existed or could ever exist. Yet somehow, impossibly, this was not quite the end of the story. Because in Norse mythology, endings are never truly final. They are transformations, changes from one state of being to another. Ragnarok wasn't just the death of the gods, it was the birth of something new. From the ashes of the burned world, new land began to emerge. Green shoots pushed through soil that had been sterilized by cosmic fire. Fresh springs bubbled up from rocks that had been melted and reformed. And in the ruins of Asgard, a few gods who had somehow survived the universal conflagration began to gather. Balder returned from Hel's realm, his death finally undone by the cosmic reset that Ragnarok had provided. His brother Herder walked beside him, blind no longer, both of them freed from the tragedy that had once divided them. Vidar and Vali, sons of Odin, had survived the final battle, and now carried their father's wisdom into the new world that was being born. Even some humans had endured the cosmic fire, hidden away in shelters that had somehow resisted universal destruction. They emerged to find a world cleansed of its old sins, ready to be shaped by whatever lessons they had learned from watching their previous civilization destroy itself. And deep in the ruins of what had once been the most magnificent library in all existence, a few books had survived, not burned but transformed, their pages now containing not just the old stories, but the true account of what had happened, what had been lost, and what had been gained in the cosmic fire that had consumed everything. This was the real victory of Ragnarok, not that good had triumphed over evil, or that order had defeated chaos, but that existence itself had proven capable of surviving its own destruction. The universe had died completely and been reborn completely, carrying forward only what was truly essential, and leaving behind what had become toxic or stagnant. The new world would face its own challenges, develop its own conflicts, probably even head toward its own eventual Ragnarok. But it would do so with the accumulated wisdom of everything that had come before, the knowledge bought with the ultimate sacrifice of gods and heroes who had chosen to die meaningfully rather than live without purpose. And so the greatest story ever told by the Norse came to its close, not with happily ever after, but with the promise that even endings can be beginnings, that even death can be transformation, that even the twilight of the gods can give birth to a new dawn. The cycle was complete, but the cycle was also just beginning. Somewhere in the new green world, around fires fed with wood from trees that had never known winter, storytellers would begin telling the tales of the old gods, the ancient heroes, the cosmic battles that had shaped existence itself. And in those stories, Thor would swing his hammer forever, Odin would seek wisdom eternally, Loki would weave his tricks endlessly, and Balder would shine with light that could never be permanently extinguished. Because in the end, the only way to truly defeat death is to be remembered. And the only way to truly defeat chaos is to create stories that give meaning to the struggle. This was the final gift of Norse mythology to everyone who heard its tales. The understanding that heroism isn't about winning, it's about facing the impossible with courage intact. That wisdom isn't about having all the answers. It's about asking the right questions, even when you know those questions will destroy you. And that love isn't about eternal happiness. It's about choosing to care for something greater than yourself, even when that choice leads inevitably to loss. The gods were dead, but their stories lived on. The world had ended, but new worlds had begun. And somewhere in the vast silence that followed the final battle, if you listened very carefully, you could still hear the echo of Heimdall's horn, calling heroes to battles that would matter precisely because they could not be won, only fought with honor until the very end. The entire chronological history of Nordic mythology was complete, from the first spark of creation in the void of Ginnungagap to the final flames of Ragnarok and the green shoots of rebirth that followed. It was a story that had taken us from the birth of the cosmos to its death and resurrection, showing us gods who were gloriously, tragically, magnificently human in their flaws and their virtues. And perhaps that was the most profound truth Norse mythology had to offer. That even gods can die, even worlds can end, even the most fundamental structures of existence can be torn apart. But the stories survive, the meaning endures, and somewhere beyond the reach of even cosmic destruction, the possibility of heroism remains eternal. The twilight had fallen, but dawn was always just one story away.